You step into the workshop just as the first light of day begins to find its way through a single east-facing window. The room is not large, its walls of rough plaster and exposed timbers holding the quiet of the early morning. Outside on the unpaved street of this small Pennsylvania town, nothing moves. No cartwheels, no voices, only a stillness so complete it seems to rest against the window glass like a held breath. The door behind you is closed softly, its iron latch settled into place without a sound, and the air inside carries a gentle blend of old wood, linseed oil, and the faint metallic scent of steel that has been worked and cooled many times over. The window is made of small panes set in a wooden frame, and through it comes a light that is still pale, still uncertain. A single beam stretches across the floorboards, angling up to touch the front edge of the workbench that stands against the opposite wall. Dust motes drift in that light, moving so slowly they seem to hang in place, turning in the faint current your own arrival has made. The bench itself is a heavy thing of oak, its top worn smooth by years of leaning, of tool handles sliding back and forth, of oil worked deep into the grain until the wood has taken on a dark, quiet luster. The front edge is slightly rounded, polished by the press of aprons and sleeves over countless hours. You settle onto the wooden stool before the bench, and your gaze falls upon a small, shallow drawer set into the bench's right side. Your hand, moving without hurry, pulls it open just enough to reveal the lock plate blanks laid flat on a piece of felt. From among them you lift one, a rectangle of steel, no longer than your open hand, still carrying the dark grey marks of the forge, its edges square, its surface faintly dimpled from the hammer that shaped it. The metal is cool against your fingertips, heavier than it looks, and you set it down upon a clean chamois skin spread in the center of the bench. The chamois is soft and pale, and the steel sits upon it like a grey stone in a quiet pool. To the left of the bench, a leather roll lies tied with a thin cord. You lift it onto the worktop and unroll it slowly, revealing the tools that will accompany the day. Small gravers with wooden handles shaped like mushrooms, their steel tips slender and bright. A tiny crossbeam hammer no longer than your finger. A brass scribe that catches the light. A fine-cut file with a handle of turned maple. An Arkansas stone in a wooden holder. A small bench vise with jaws padded in soft leather. Each tool lies in its own pocket, worn to its shape, and you touch each one lightly as you think of the work ahead. None of them makes a sound as you lift them out, one by one, setting them in a row along the top of the chamois skin. The lock plate rests unmoving under the light that now has grown a little stronger, taking on a warmer cast as the sun climbs above the rooftops. You take up the fine-cut file and turn it over in your hands, noting the slight shine along its teeth from long use. With the lock plate held steady under your left palm, you begin to draw the file across its surface in slow, even strokes. The sound is a soft hiss, steady and low, repeating without variation as the file moves forward and lifts, then moves forward again. Metal dust, fine as flour, gathers in a silver-grey line beside the path of the file, and after every few strokes you pause to brush it away with a fold of linen that lies at your elbow. The cloth is old and soft, frayed at the edges, and it catches the particles without raising them into the air. The steel begins to change under your hand, losing the roughness of the forge, taking on a matte grey uniformity. You turn the lock plate over and work the backside as well, though with fewer strokes, just enough to remove any burrs that might catch against the stock later. Then you set the file aside and reach for the waterstone, its surface slicked with a drop of oil that spreads into a thin amber sheen. You place the stone flat on the bench and lift the lock plate onto it, holding it by the edges, moving it in slow circles that leave spiral trails in the oil. The sound here is wetter, a soft grinding whisper that seems to sink into the walls without echo. The motion is steady, your shoulder doing the work while your fingers only guide, and after a while, the steel face becomes as smooth as a calm pond. When you lift the lock plate from the stone and wipe it clean with the linen, the surface is a uniform pale grey, dull and velvety, without any glint. You hold it up toward the window and tilt it slightly under the light to see the true flatness of the face. Satisfied, you set it down again on the chamois and reach for the brass scribe, a slim rod with a fine point. A borderline must be drawn first, a modest rectangle set in from the edges to frame the scrollwork to come. You position the scribe against a small steel rule, aligning it carefully, and draw the line with one slow pull, letting the point scratch a bright, hair-thin track into the grey oxide. The line runs parallel to the edge, a quarter-inch in, and when you lift the scribe you see a tiny curl of brass at the end of the scratch that you blow away with a soft breath. You draw all 4 sides of the border, pausing between each pull to reposition the rule and check the distance. The lines meet at the corners without overshooting, and inside this quiet frame the scroll work will find its home. The area seems large now, an empty field of grey steel, and you look at it for a long moment without allowing any design to form fully in your mind, only holding the space in your gaze the way you might hold a cup of cool water before drinking. The tools wait beside your hand. The gravers are lined according to the shape of their tips, square, lozenge, flat. The light now falls across the entire bench top, warm as old honey, and it lays a soft glow over the steel and the wood and the leather alike. A small sound comes from outside the window, the first bird of the morning, a sparrow settling on the stone sill. You do not look up, but the sound registers faintly as you pick up the square graver and turn it over in your fingers. The wooden handle is worn smooth where it rests against the palm, the mushroom shape fitting the hollow of your hand as if it has grown there over many seasons. The steel tip is bright, its cutting face angled just so, and you bring it close to your eyes to examine the edge for any dullness. Finding it true, you set it down and instead take up the Arkansas stone, giving it a fresh white before you touch the graver to it. With the lightest of pressure you draw the cutting face across the stone, turning the tool slightly each time, counting 10 passes for each side, then 10 for the heel. The sound is a faint tick-tick that blends with the distant murmur of the sparrow, now joined by a second. The little vise is next. You clamp it to the edge of the bench, tightening the wooden screw until it grips solidly. Its jaws are lined with 2 strips of leather, soft and dark with oil, and you place the lock plate between them, just tightly enough to hold it without marking the edges. The vise allows you to rotate the work, and you test this now, turning the lock plate so the surface catches the light at an angle that makes the scribed borderline stand out like fine silver wire. The rest of the shop holds its silence, content to be a backdrop of greys and browns, the unlit forge in the corner, the row of finished rifle barrels leaning against the wall, the racks of chisels and saws, all still in the dimness outside the window's reach. You settle your stool closer to the bench, your feet flat on the floor, your back straight but not stiff. The graver is taken into your right hand, its handle cradled in the palm, while your index finger rests along the steel near the tip to guide it. Your left hand holds the lock plate steady through the vise, thumb and forefinger ready to rotate the work as needed. The first cut will be nothing more than a shallow scratch, a deepening of the scribed line that will become the central vine of the scroll. You touch the point of the graver to the steel just inside the top border, letting it catch on the faint mark you left earlier. You apply a gentle, steady push, and the tool begins to move, peeling up a whisper of steel, no thicker than a hair. The line emerges slowly, a dark groove against the grey, curving in a graceful arc that your hand follows without conscious thought. The movement is so fine, so deliberate, that you can feel each tiny grain of metal giving way under the edge. When you reach the end of the first curve, a simple inward spiral, you lift the graver and blow gently on the cut, clearing the tiny shaving that has curled up like a silver eyelash, letting it fall away onto the chamois. The workshop seems to draw a long, slow breath with you. The light shifts a little, the beam from the window now bright enough to make the dust motes dance in a gentle column above the floor. You reposition the graver, your hand moving back to the start of another line, this one branching from the first, a tendril that will curl outward and down, then back upon itself in a figure no larger than a thumbprint. You push again, and the tool answers with a soft sighing sound, quite unlike the hiss of the file, more a gentle scraping that rises and falls as you guide it through the steel. The rhythm of the work settles into your body, the way a slow walk settles into the legs, and you find yourself breathing in time with each pass of the graver. Inhale as you position the tool, exhale as the cut proceeds, a silent pause before the next. The walls of the workshop, the floorboards, the beams overhead, all seem to listen without imposing, content to be the container of this single patient act. From time to time you pause and lift a small linen pad moistened with a drop of oil, wiping the cut to clear away any clinging particles. The oil brings out the dark line of the groove, making it stand clearly against the pale grey, and you study the shape of the scroll for a long moment without judgment, only noting where the curve might deepen, where a new turn might flow. The design is growing organically, a vine that has never lived except in steel and will never move except under the slow dance of light. The feeling is not one of excitement, it is a quiet focus, like watching water seep slowly into dry ground. The sparrows outside have grown quiet again, perhaps flown away, and the only sounds now are the graver, the soft squeak of the leather vice pad when you twist the lock plate a fraction, and the occasional creak of the wooden floor as you shift your weight. The scent of linseed oil and iron remains constant, layered under the cooler smell of the stone walls, and the temperature inside the shop has not yet warmed beyond a comfortable coolness. You wear a long linen apron over a simple wool shirt, the sleeves rolled just below the elbow, and the fabric moves softly when you reach for another tool or wipe the steel with the linen. The day outside has not announced itself with any fanfare. It simply exists, and inside the workshop you exist inside it, nowhere else, with nothing else. As the first full scroll begins to take shape, a main stem curling left and then right in a gentle S-curve, you set aside the square graver and pick up the lozenge graver, its tip formed into a narrow diamond. This tool will later cut the hair-thin shading lines that run beside the main cuts to give depth, but for now you lay it on the chamois and decide to deepen a few of the vine lines with a second pass of the square graver, pressing just a little more firmly, hearing the same soft sigh grow a shade louder as the groove widens by a fraction. Each cut travels a path you know without having to think, as though your hand remembers curves it has made on other lot plates in other seasons, the muscle memory older than the morning. You lift and set, the graver describing its slow conversation with the metal. Every so often you pause to rest your eyes, looking away from the steel to the window where the light has now yellowed slightly toward the hue of straw. The sky beyond the glass is a pale, even blue without a single cloud, and the roof of the building opposite shows its shingles in sharp silhouette. A wagon might roll by later, a dog might bark, but those things belong to another hour and have not yet arrived. For now, the only story is the growth of the scrollwork on the lock plate, a quiet garden being planted in miniature, each line a seed that will one day catch the eye of a hunter or a farmer taking his rifle from the mantle. But that is far from this moment, and you do not dwell on it. You take up a small, fine file with a rounded edge and use it to ease the corners of the lock plate just slightly, removing the sharpness, a touch so light it barely changes the shape. The sound is like a mouse scratching in straw, gentle and sporadic. Then you blow the dust away again and return to the graver, starting a new tendril that begins near the lower left corner and rises, curling under itself in a tight spiral before opening into a small fan of lines that will become leaves. Your thumb presses lightly against the side of the tool for stability, and the cut proceeds without waver. The steel gives way, as it has since the first stroke, offering a resistance that is constant and reassuring, like the feel of a boat's oar pulling through calm water. Time passes in the workshop without measure. The clock on the mantel, if there even is one, does not chime, and you have no need to count the hours. The sunbeam that once angled across the floor has now climbed the bench leg and is touching the front of the apron. You shift the vise a quarter turn, and the light gleams on the freshly cut scrollwork, picking out each line as a dart mark on a field of silver grey. You run the tip of your little finger over a cut, feeling the faint catch of the metal, then wipe it again with the oiled cloth. The smell of the oil rises briefly, then settles, and so the morning moves, slowly, peacefully, one careful cut after another, the lock plate becoming more than it was, while the gunsmith, in his quiet workshop, remains perfectly still inside the slow current of the day. The lock plate blank lies on the chamois before you, its surface still carrying the faint grey scale of the forge. This is the steel as it came from the smith, its edges square and its face marked here and there with the shallow dimples of the hammer that shaped it. You have already drawn it from the little drawer and set it in place, and now, in the quiet of the early morning, the true preparation begins. The work of engraving fine scrollwork cannot start until the steel is made perfectly smooth, until the face becomes a uniform ground that will hold every delicate line without interruption. So you turn your attention to the first of the finishing tools, the fine-cut file with its maple handle worn dark by the oils of your hand. You lift the file and hold it lightly, the handle resting across your palm while your thumb lies along the flat of the tang. The teeth of the file are fine, almost invisible to the eye, and they gleam faintly when you tilt the tool toward the window. The lock plate waits, cool and still, and you place your left hand upon it to hold it steady against the chamois. The file comes down at a low angle, its cutting face meeting the steel near the top left corner, and you push it forward with a steady, unhurried motion. The sound that rises is a soft shh sound, a hush of metal on metal that fills the small space between your hands and the bench. You draw the file back without pressure, lift it a fraction, then set it down again and push forward, repeating the stroke over a new line of steel just beside the first. The motion settles into a slow, even pattern, forward and lift, the file moving across the surface in long parallel passes. Each stroke removes a tiny layer of the forged scale, reducing the high spots, gradually merging the dimpled texture into a single plane. A fine grey powder begins to collect on the chamois beside the lock plate, a dust so light that the faintest breath would scatter it. After every few strokes you pause, take up the folded linen cloth from its place at your elbow, and wipe the surface clean. The cloth moves in a gentle arc, picking up the particles, and you shake it softly over a small wooden tray set on the floor beside the stool. Then you sight down the length of the lock plate, holding it up toward the window so the light rakes across the metal, revealing any unevenness as tiny shadows. The high spots glint slightly, the low spots remain dull, and you note where the file must touch again. You turn the lock plate around and work the opposite end, your left hand repositioning itself with the ease of long habit. The file moves again, the same soft shh, repeating without hurry, and the surface slowly loses its birthmarks. The grey becomes lighter, more even, the marks of the hammer fading into a matte uniformity. When you have worked the entire face, you turn the lock plate over and dress the back with a dozen light strokes, just enough to remove any sharp burr along the edges. Then you set the file down on the bench, its handle aligned with the edge of the chamois, and pick up a small brass brush to clean its teeth. The brush scuffs quietly over the file, dislodging the tiny metal particles that cling between the grooves, and you blow them away toward the floor, where they join the dust of other mornings. The lock plate now has a smoothness that the file alone can give, but it is not yet ready. The microscopic scratches left by the file must be softened further, and for this you reach for the waterstone. It sits in its wooden holder, a rectangular block of grey Arkansas stone, with a surface as flat as a frozen pond. You lift it from its place and set it directly before you, then reach for the small oil bottle with its cork stopper. A single drop of light oil falls onto the stone and spreads into a thin amber film. You place the lock plate flat upon the stone, gripping it by the edges with the tips of your fingers, and begin to move it in a slow circular path. The oil swirls beneath the steel, carrying away the faintest particles, and the sound is a wet, grinding whisper that seems to hum rather than scrape. Your shoulder rises and falls with the motion, and your fingers maintain a gentle, constant pressure that presses the lock plate evenly against the abrasive surface. Around and around you move the steel, varying the direction every so often to ensure the wear is uniform, clockwise for 20 turns, then counterclockwise for 20 more, then a figure-8 pattern that crosses the stone's center. The oil gradually darkens with the fine metal it has lifted, turning from amber to a cloudy grey, and you pause to wipe the stone clean with a corner of the linen cloth before adding a fresh drop and resuming. The rhythm of the work is almost meditative now, your breathing slow and deep, your eyes half-lidded as you watch the steel travel its small circles. The scent of oil and stone mingles with the cooler air of the workshop, and the light through the window has brightened enough to cast a distinct glow across the bench top. After a long while, you lift the lock plate from the stone and wipe it thoroughly, turning it under the light to examine its surface. The grey is now deep and even, without any visible scratches or marks, a perfect matte ground that catches the light in a soft, velvety way. You set it down once more on the chamois and take up the small steel rule and the brass scribe. The border must be drawn now, the quiet frame that will contain the scrollwork and keep it from wandering to the very edges of the lock plate. You position the rule along one long edge, setting it precisely 1/4 of an inch inward, and hold it firmly with your left hand while your right hand lowers the scribe's fine point to the steel. The line begins with a single steady pull, the brass point scratching a hair-thin bright track that follows the rule without wavering. When you reach the corner, you lift the scribe, breathe softly on the line to clear the tiny brass fragment, and then reposition the rule along the short edge. Each side receives its line in turn, the 4 marks meeting at neat right angles that enclose a clean rectangle. Inside this rectangle, the scrollwork will live, and you look at the empty space for a moment, picturing nothing in particular, simply acknowledging the quiet potential of the ground you have prepared. The lines shimmer faintly when the light hits them, standing out against the dull grey field, and you know they will guide the graver when the time comes. But for now, the preparation is complete, and you set the scribe and rule aside, aligning them with the other tools at the top of the chamois. Your hands rest for a moment on the edge of the bench, the fingertips registering the smoothness of the oak, while your eyes travel over the lock plate one last time. Everything in the room seems to settle into a deeper stillness. The file, the stone, the scribe have all spoken their quiet parts, and now they wait. The window light has lost its early paleness and become the steady, golden glow of mid-morning, a light that promises many more hours of slow, careful work. You feel a gentle satisfaction that is not sharp or proud, but simply the quiet acknowledgement that the surface is ready. The lock plate lies on the chamois like a blank page in a book that will be filled not with words, but with curling lines and shaded leaves. You pick up the oil bottle once more and dab a fingertip of oil onto the steel, spreading it lightly with the pad of your thumb, then wipe it away with the linen so that a microscopic film remains to protect the surface from any stray humidity. The metal gleams dully, patient and still. Outside, the town has begun its day faintly, a distant murmur of activity that does not enter the workshop. A horse's hoof clops somewhere down the street. A door opens and closes. A voice calls a greeting that dissolves before it reaches your ears. You pay none of it any mind, your attention fully anchored to the small rectangle of steel and the tools that surround it. The stool creaks softly as you shift your weight, and you realize you have been sitting in almost the same position for a long while. You stand slowly, your knees straightening with a quiet pop, and walk to the window. Through the small panes you see the roof of the building across the way, its shingles warm in the sunlight, and a patch of sky of the palest blue. You draw a deep breath of air that seeps through the window frame, cool and a little dusty, then return to the bench. The chamois beneath the lock plate has gathered a faint ring of metal dust around its edges, and you gather the cloth carefully, folding it inward so the dust is trapped, then set it aside and spread a fresh piece of chamois in its place. The lock plate goes back onto the new cloth, and you seat yourself once more, adjusting the stool until your arms rest comfortably at the correct height. The little bench waits at the edge of the worktop, its jaws padded with dark leather, and you consider mounting the lock plate now to begin the first scratches of the scroll. But the chapter of preparation is not quite finished. There is one more step, a gentle burnishing of the surface with a polished steel tool, just to close any remaining microscopic pores in the metal and give the graver the smoothest possible ground. You reach for the burnisher, a slender rod of hardened steel with a rounded, mirror-bright tip, and draw it toward you. With the lock plate held flat against the chamois, you press the burnisher's tip at the top corner and stroke downward in a single, fluid motion, as if you were smoothing a wrinkle from fine cloth. The tool glides over the surface without resistance, leaving behind a trail of faint brightness where the metal compresses under the pressure. You make another stroke parallel to the first, overlapping it just a little, and continue this until the entire face of the lock plate has been gently polished by the burnisher. The sound is barely audible, a feathery hiss that is more felt than heard. When you finish, the surface has taken on the faintest sheen, still a matte grey, but with a subtle luster that makes the scribed border lines stand out with greater clarity. Now, the preparation is truly done. You set the burnisher back in its leather pocket, clean the lock plate one last time with a soft cloth, and arrange the tools you will need for the next stage. The square graver, the lozenge graver, the small hammer, the magnifying lens on its brass arm, all are brought out and placed in a neat row. The lock plate, at last, is ready to receive its scroll work. The morning has advanced without you noticing. The sunbeam that once struck the floor is now halfway up the bench leg, and the shadows in the corners of the workshop have softened. You rest your hands palm down on the edge of the bench and simply look at the steel, letting your mind settle into the quiet state that the work requires. Your breathing is slow and even, your shoulders relaxed, your thoughts not racing but drifting like the dust motes in the light. The preparation has been a long, gentle labor, and it has filled the early hours with a kind of peace that words cannot touch. Now the grave awaits, and the first curving line of the scrollwork is only a heartbeat away. The lock plate rests on the fresh chamois, its surface now a uniform grey field, waiting for the first true mark of the graver. But before a single curl can be drawn, the tools themselves must be chosen, examined, and prepared with the same slow care that has already smoothed the steel. You pull the leather tool roll toward you across the bench top, the soft cord falling loose as you unroll it fully, revealing the row of gravers tucked into their snug pockets. There are three main types laid out before you: the square graver, the lozenge graver, and the flat graver. Each has its own purpose, its own shape of cut, and your hand hovers over them for a moment, not in hesitation, but in the quiet ritual of selection. The square graver is the one you will use first, the workhorse of the engraver's art. You lift it from its pocket and hold it up to the window light. Its steel shank is square in cross-section, tapering to a cutting face that has been ground to a precise angle, the very tip a tiny diamond-shaped point. The wooden handle is short and rounded like a mushroom cap, worn to a warm brown patina that fits exactly into the hollow of your palm. You turn it slowly, watching the way the light slides along the polished bevel, and you note the faintest hint of dullness on the cutting edge. Not enough to see easily, but enough that your thumb, drawn lightly across it, feels a soft rounding where there should be a crisp bite. This graver has cut many lines before today, and it will need a careful touch on the stone before it can cut again. You set the square graver down on the cami and lift the lozenge graver next. Its cross-section is a narrow diamond, the faces meeting at sharper angles than the square, designed for the finer shading lines and delicate details. This tool will be needed later for the thin inner strokes that run alongside the main scrolls, giving depth and shadow. Its handle is identical in shape to the first, the same mushroom form and the same dark wood, worn just as smooth. You examine its tip with the same slow attention, holding it near your eye, blinking once as you register that its edge is still keen from the last sharpening, ready to use without further work. You place it beside the square graver, the two tools now aligned like quiet sentinels. The flat graver comes out last, its blade wider and thinner, almost like a tiny chisel. It will be used to cut the wider parts of the scroll, the gentle flares at the ends of tendrils that need a broader line than the square graver can give. You test its edge with your thumb, finding it serviceable but in need of a light touch-up, and you add it to the small line of tools awaiting the stone. The leather roll sits open with the other tools still in their pockets: the scribe, the small hammer, the punches, the burnisher. But for now your attention belongs entirely to the three gravers on the chamois. You reach for the Arkansas stone, the same fine grey block that you used to smooth the lock plate, but now you turn it over to its clean side, a surface free of oil and metal residue, specifically reserved for sharpening engraving tools. You wipe it once with a dry corner of the linen cloth, removing any invisible dust, and set it squarely before you. Then you lift the square graver, settling its mushroom handle into your right palm, while your left hand steadies the stone, fingers curled around the wooden holder. The angle at which you present the graver to the stone is critical, a geometry learned over years and held in the muscles of your hand rather than the front of your thoughts. You tilt the tool until both of the small bevel faces at the tip sit flat against the stone at the same time, and then, with a breath held gently, you push the graver forward along the stone's length, drawing the cutting edge across the abrasive surface in a stroke that is both firm and feather-light. The sound is a faint, high tick, repeated as you lift the tool, bring it back to the near edge of the stone, and push again. You count the passes under your breath, not in words but in a silent rhythm that your lips barely form, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then a pause to turn the graver 90 degrees to address the other pair of faces, and again the quiet count to 5. The steel tip grows keener with each pass, the microscopic burr being worn away and a clean, sharp edge emerging. You hold the graver to the light once more, tilting it until the edge catches a glint as thin as a spider's thread, and you nod slightly, satisfied. The same ritual repeats for the flat graver, though its wider cutting face requires a slightly different angle and a slightly longer stroke. The sound a lower, softer tick-tick that blends with the stillness. The lozenge graver you merely touch to the stone for 3 light passes on each face, a polish rather than a sharpening, and then set it down again. With the sharpening done, you take up the small bottle of oil and remove its cork. The oil inside is pale and light, the same oil that has scented the workshop since the morning began. You tip the bottle just enough to release a single drop onto the pad of your index finger, then touch that drop to the cutting face of the square graver, spreading it in a thin, gleaming film that travels along the bevel and catches the light. You repeat this for the flat graver, a tiny dab that you rub gently into the steel with a soft cloth, and for the lozenge graver, the barest hint of oil to keep its edge from biting too harshly into the metal. The oil serves 2 purposes. It lubricates the cut, making the graver glide with less resistance, and it protects the fine edge from the microscopic corrosion that can dull it over time. You wipe your fingertip on the cloth and set the oil bottle back in its place at the rear of the bench. Now the gravers are ready, their edges bright and their faces gleaming with the faintest sheen of oil. You line them up in the order they will be used. Square graver first, then the lozenge, then the flat. Each tool lying parallel to the others on the chamois like 3 quiet instruments waiting for a concert will last the whole day. Your hands pause for a moment, resting on the edge of the bench, and you let your gaze drift across the tools, the stone, the lock plate, the window. The morning light has become steady and golden, a wash of warmth that fills the workshop without glare, and it falls across the bench in a broad rectangle that illuminates every detail: the grain of the wood, the weave of the chamois, the tiny reflection in the oiled steel. The next step is to mount the lock plate and the small bench vise, and you turn your stool a fraction to face it directly. The vise is already clamped to the front edge of the bench, its iron body firm against the oak, its wooden screw handle pointing toward you. You reach for the lock plate, lifting it gently from the chamois by its edges, careful not to touch the prepared surface with your bare fingers. The steel is cool and smooth, and you hold it for a moment between your hands, feeling its weight, its solidity, before lowering it into the open jaws of the vise. The jaws are lined with 2 strips of dark leather, supple and oil darkened, and they close around the lock plate with a soft, even pressure as you turn the wooden screw. You tighten it just enough to hold the steel firmly without marking its edges, testing the grip with a gentle wiggle of your finger until you are satisfied. The vise is mounted on a swivel, and you loosen a small thumb screw beneath it to allow the entire mechanism to rotate. You turn the lock plate slowly, tilting its surface this way and that, until the scribed border lines catch the light from the window exactly. The faint scratches gleam like threads of silver against the matte grey, and the rectangle they form stands out clearly, defining the field where the scrollwork will grow. You tighten the thumb screw again, locking the angle in place, and now the lock plate sits before you at the perfect orientation, the light raking across it from left to right, every detail of the surface clearly visible. You settle yourself on the stool, your feet flat on the floorboards, your back straight but relaxed. The square graver is taken up first, its mushroom handle finding the hollow of your right palm as naturally as a doorknob finds a hand. Your index finger extends along the steel shank, not gripping but guiding, while your thumb rests on one flat side to give lateral control. Your left hand comes to rest on the vise, the thumb and forefinger positioned to rotate the lock plate in tiny increments as the cuts progress. For a long, quiet moment, you simply hold the graver above the steel, not yet touching, letting your breathing slow to match the stillness of the room. The tip hovers a quarter inch above the top borderline, steady and patient, and you feel the familiar calm settle over you like a blanket drawn up to the chin. The first cut will be the central vine of the scroll, the main line from which all others will branch. You lower the graver until its point touches the scribed mark at the top center of the border rectangle, just where the line you will cut has been faintly drawn. The contact is barely perceptible, a tiny catch of steel on steel, and you apply a gentle forward pressure with your palm while your left hand braces the vise. The graver begins to move, peeling up the thinnest possible shaving of metal, a curl so fine it looks like a hair of silver rising from the groove. The line that emerges is dark and sharp, perfectly smooth, curving to the right in a graceful arc that follows the scribed guide without a single waver. The sound is a soft, steady sigh, the same sound the file made, but higher and more delicate, like the whisper of a page being turned very slowly. You push the graver forward 1/4 of an inch, then lift, leaving the cut clean and bright, and you blow gently on the groove to clear the tiny shaving, which flutters away onto the chamois. You reposition the graver at the end of the cut, aligning it with the scribed line where the vine continues to curl outward and then back upon itself in a tight spiral. The tool bites again, and you push forward, feeling the subtle resistance of the steel through the wooden handle, a feedback so fine it travels up your arm as a gentle hum. Your left hand rotates the vise a fraction, and the curve of the line shifts under the graver's point, the work and the tool moving together in a slow dance. The spiral takes shape, a small circle that wraps inward like a sleeping fern, and when you lift the graver at the center point, the line is complete. The first scroll, small and perfect, shining dark against the gray. You sit back for a moment, letting the graver rest on the chamois, and you examine the cut under the light. The groove is even in depth, free of burrs or jagged edges, and the oil you applied has done its work, leaving the steel of the cut glossy and dark. You wipe the surface with a clean linen pad, removing any stray dust, and the scroll seems to deepen as the oil settles into the groove. Then you pick up the graver again and begin the next line, a branch that peels away from the main vine, heading downward and to the left in a long, gentle undulation. This line will become a tendril, and later it will sprout leaves and smaller curls, but for now it is only a single graceful stroke that you draw with the same patient pressure, the same slow sigh, the same rotation of the vise under your left hand. The work stretches out before you like a quiet road, and you walk it one careful step at a time. As the morning deepens, the pattern on the lock plate grows incrementally. The square graver continues to do its work, laying down the primary structure of the scrollwork, a central vine that curves across the upper third of the plate, branching into 3 main tendrils that flow downward and outward, each one ending in a tight spiral that will later be shaded and leafed. You pause occasionally to wipe the tool's tip with an oiled cloth, clearing away the microscopic buildup of steel that can cling to the cutting edge, and each time you do, you touch the graver lightly to the Arkansas stone for a single pass, refreshing its keenness. The rhythm has settled into your bones now, a slow and steady pulse that beats not in time, but in the movement of the hand, the advance of the line, the soft lift and return. There is no urgency, no awareness of the hour, only the cool steel under your fingers and the golden light falling across the bench. The workshop remains silent except for the sounds of the work, the sigh of the graver, the tiny creak of the leather vise pads when you rotate the lock plate, the occasional soft tap when you use the little hammer to set a punch at the termination of a scroll. The sparrows have returned to the windowsill, their faint chirping and distant music you hear without listening, and the air still carries the mingled smells of linseed oil and old wood. You feel the warmth of the sun on your left shoulder now, the beam having crept across the floor and climbed the bench leg to reach you, and you welcome it as a gentle companion. The gravers lie ready, the oil glistens on their cutting faces, and the lock plate holds its growing garden of steel lines with a patience that mirrors your own. The chapter of preparation is over. The chapter of cutting has begun, and it will continue with the same peaceful, unbroken stillness until the last curl is drawn. With the square graver settled in the hollow of your right palm, its mushroom handle pressing gently against the fleshy base of your thumb, you lower the point to the steel once more. The lock plate sits angled in the vise so that the scribed borderlines catch the morning light as faint silver threads, and just inside the top edge, a faint guide mark extends downward in a soft arc, the path you will now follow with the first true cut. Your index finger rests along the flat of the graver's shank, not clamping but guiding, while your left hand holds the edge of the vise frame, thumb and forefinger poised to turn the work in tiny increments. The tip of the graver meets the metal exactly where the scribed line begins, and you apply a gentle forward pressure, letting the sharpened bevel find its bite. The cut that opens is not a dramatic incision, but a quiet, dark hairline that seems to bloom on the grey surface like a single ink stroke drawn across unmarked paper. The steel yields under the tool with a soft, steady sigh, a sound so close to silence that it might be mistaken for the breath of the room itself. You push the graver forward along the curve at a pace that matches the slow movement of dust drifting through the window beam, feeling every microscopic grain of metal part before the cutting edge. The line travels to the right and then begins to curl inward, the beginning of a spiral that will become the main vine of the scrollwork, and as it curves your left hand rotates the vise just a fraction, turning the lock plate into the graver rather than forcing the tool to fight its own path. Your thumb, resting on the heel of the graver, controls the depth by subtle pressure, keeping the groove shallow and even, no deeper than a fingernail's thickness. As the spiral completes its first full turn, you lift the graver with a gentle upward motion that leaves the end of the cut clean, without a burr. A tiny shaving of steel, curled into a silver comma finer than a hair, rises from the groove and clings to the edge of the line, and you lean forward to blow it away with a soft, steady breath that sends it drifting onto the chamois. Then you sit back and let your eyes follow the path of the new cut, watching how the window light slides along its length, catching in the groove to make it gleam dark as wet ink, while the surrounding steel remains its quiet, matte grey. The contrast is subtle but clear, and the sight of it holds your attention for a long, still moment, a wordless assessment of the day's first complete scroll. You reposition the graver at the center point of the spiral, where the line has curled in upon itself, and begin a new cut that branches outward to the left. This will be the first tendril, a secondary vine that flows away from the main body to explore the empty field of the lock plate's upper corner. The motion is the same, a steady push, the sigh of steel, the slow rotation of the vise under your left hand, the tiny curl of metal lifting from the groove like a silver eyelash. But this cut runs straighter at first, a long descending curve that dips down toward the lower border before you decide to let it split again. You pause halfway along its length, lifting the graver, and turn the lock plate a quarter circle to bring the uncut portion into the best light. Then you touch the tool back to the steel and continue the line, letting it curl upward into a tight, closed volute that resembles a fern frond just before it unfurls. 2 more soft breaths clear the shavings, and you sit back once more. The workshop now seems to settle around you with the same deliberate stillness that you bring to each cut. The sparrows that had been chattering on the windowsill have flown off, leaving only the faint memory of their sound, and the light through the small panes has warmed to a pale gold that washes across the entire bench. You pick up the linen cloth, moistened with a drop of oil, and draw it gently along the new grooves, clearing away any clinging particles and leaving the lines dark and crisp. The oiled steel responds by deepening the contrast, the scrollwork now standing out like a drawing in charcoal on grey paper. The vine and its first tendril have a balanced asymmetry, a natural flow that your hand has guided without the need for a drawn pattern beyond the faint scribed marks. The curves have emerged from your fingers as if they knew where to go all along. You consider the next branch, a line that will begin near the base of the main spiral and curl downward to fill the lower portion of the lock plate. But before you start, you lift the square graver to the light and examine its tip for the faintest rounding that might have occurred after those first cuts. Finding the edge still true, you touch it once to the Arkansas stone with a single light pass on each face, more a habit than a necessity, and then reapply the thinnest film of oil with your fingertip. The tool feels warm in your hand now, as if it has woken from its rest, and when you settle it back into your palm, the fit is so familiar that the graver seems an extension of your own fingers. The next cut begins where the main spiral loops nearest the left border, and you angle the graver to enter the steel at a shallow slant so that the line starts thin and gradually widens as you push forward. This creates a gentle flare at the base of the tendril, a subtle thickening that will later be shaded with the lozenge graver to give a sense of depth. The sound of this cut is a little lower, a soft hum rather than a sigh, because the wider bite of the graver meets more resistance, and you compensate by pressing with the heel of your palm while your thumb lifts slightly to maintain the angle. The line travels downward in a smooth arc, passing beneath the first tendril, and then hooks to the right in a tight reverse curve before ending in another closed spiral. When you lift the graver, the shaving that curls up is slightly larger, a silver thread that catches the light and hangs for an instant before you blow it clear, watching it tumble across the chamois to join the others. By now, the lock plate has begun to show the skeleton of the scrollwork, a few graceful lines that suggest the full pattern without yet filling it. You turn the visor half rotation to bring the lower portion into view, and you see an empty space between the descending tendril and the bottom border that invites another branch. With the scribe you had earlier marked a faint guideline here, a ghost of a curve that now shows as a pale scratch, and you align the graver's point with its start. The cut proceeds, as all the others have, a slow deliberate push, the left hand turning the vise just as the curve reaches its apex, the thumb softening the pressure as you approach the end so that the line tapers off gently. This tendril ends not in a spiral, but in a pair of small opposing curls, a double volute that you form by cutting two short arcs that meet at their tips. You complete the first arc, lift the graver, blow away the shaving, and then cut the second arc from the opposite direction, meeting the first exactly. The result is a tiny heart-shaped flourish that sits quietly at the margin of the field. The process continues, calm and unhurried, every new line added to the growing garden of steel. You pause now and then, not from fatigue, but from the simple wish to observe how the light moves across the work, how the cut lines shift from dark to bright when the angle changes. Holding the lock plate up with 2 fingers, you tilt it slowly under the window beam and watch the grooves catch the sun, each one flaring for a second like a line of gold before dimming again. This play of light confirms the evenness of your cuts. A shallow section would refuse the gleam, a too deep section would swallow it, but these lines are balanced, consistent, born from a steady hand and a quiet mind. With the main structural lines all scribed, you bring out the lozenge graver for the first time today. This tool, with its narrow diamond tip, will cut the fine shading lines that run parallel to the main curves, giving the illusion of 3-dimensional depth. You hold it the same way as the square graver, the mushroom handle nestled in your palm, and test its feel on a scrap of thin brass stored in the bench drawer, just to wake the edge. The scratch it leaves on the brass is as thin as a spider's silk, and you are satisfied. Returning to the lock plate, you choose the long descending tendril as the first candidate for shading and align the lozenge graver slightly to the right of the main groove, starting near the top where the tendril branches from the vine. The cut you make now is not a deep one, it is a surface line, a whisper of a cut that barely lifts any metal at all, just brightening the steel beside the dark groove to create a soft highlight that shifts as the angle of view changes. You push forward in a smooth, continuous stroke that shadows the curve exactly, staying a constant distance from the main line as if drawn with a compass, and the sound is a faint rustle, like a dry leaf skimming over stone. Multiple shading lines follow, each one placed with the same careful distance. For the main spiral, you cut 3 parallel lines inside the innermost curve, each line shorter than the last, so that the spiral appears to recede into a shadowed center. The concentration required for this work is gentle and absorbing. Your eyes focus only on the tiny point of contact between tool and steel, and the rest of the room fades into a soft blur of brown and gold. Time passes without measure, the cuts accumulating like slow stitches in cloth. When you finally put down the lozenge graver to rest your hands, the scrollwork has taken on a new complexity, the simple vines now accompanied by their quiet shadows, and the lock plate seems to carry a depth that the flat steel cannot truly possess. You clean the entire surface with the oiled linen, drawing the cloth carefully over the fresh shading lines to remove any invisible burrs, and then you use a dry corner to buff the steel lightly, bringing up a subtle luster on the unengraved ground. The vignette looks, for a moment, like a fragment of timeless ornament, something that could have existed 100 years ago or 100 years hence, belonging only to the patient hands that made it. The window behind you is brightened with the approach of noon, and a single fly buzzes lazily near the upper pane, its drone adding a low, sleepy note to the quiet. You watch the fly for a second, not with irritation, but with the same detached attention you give to everything in the workshop, then return your gaze to the lock plate where the next unshaded curve awaits. There are moments when you must decide exactly how one scroll will connect to another, how a gap will be filled by a small leaf or a cluster of dots, and these decisions arrive not as thoughts, but as gentle inclinations, the hand knowing what the eye has not yet spoken. You take up the square graver once more, and add a series of small leaves along the outer edge of the main vine, each leaf formed by 3 tiny cuts, one central spine, and 2 angled strokes that meet at the tip. The rhythm of these cuts is quicker, but no less careful. A soft tap of the graver against the steel, followed by 2 flicks of the wrist, and the leaf appears, no larger than a grain of rice, its shape crisp and symmetrical. You place 5 leaves in a descending row, then pause to wipe away the tiny shavings, watching how they cling to the oiled cloth like metallic dust. Slowly, the upper half of the lock plate fills with ornament. The design is almost complete in its foundation, though many hours of detail work remain. You decide that the next session will bring the background stippling, a field of fine dots punched into the empty space behind the scrolls, to make the foreground lines stand proud. But that task belongs to another chapter of the day. For now you simply admire the quiet achievement of the first gentle curves, the lines that have transformed a blank rectangle of steel into the beginning of beauty. You lift the lock plate from the vise, cradling it on the chamois in your open palm, and carry it to the window where the full sunlight can touch it directly. In that brighter light, every curl and shadow shows clearly, and you trace your eye along the main spiral, the descending tendrils, the paired volutes, the tiny leaves all glittering faintly with residual oil. Nothing is rushed, nothing is flawed, and the feeling that rises is not pride, but a calm satisfaction, the same feeling a gardener might know when looking at a freshly planted bed. After a long moment you return the lock plate to the bench, settling it back into the vise with the same careful grip, and you leave it there, still exposed to the shifting afternoon light that will soon slope lower through the window. The gravers rest side by side on the chamois, their wooden handles warm from your palms, their cutting edges still keen. The workshop has held its peace throughout the morning, and it will continue to do so, enfolding the slow work like a cupped hand that shelters a small flame. You draw the linen cloth across your fingertips, wiping away the faint residue of oil and steel, and then fold your hands loosely on the edge of the bench, letting the stillness flow back into your bones as you prepare for whatever the next hour will bring. With the lock plate held steady in the leather-padded vise and the square graver resting once more in your palm, the workshop arrives at that quiet hour where the mind stops counting and the body takes over. The initial cuts of the scrollwork are all in place, the main vine curling across the upper field, the descending tendrils reaching toward the bottom corners like the arms of a slow river. What remains now is not a single act of creation, but an extended, patient deepening of everything already begun. You settle on the stool and let your shoulders drop, feeling the familiar weight of the tool in your hand, and you begin the rhythm that will carry you through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. The rhythm is not a conscious pattern, but a natural flow that rises from the work itself. You press the graver forward into the steel with a gentle push from the heel of your palm, guiding the tip along a curve that already exists as a faint, scribed line. The tool moves 1/4 of an inch, slicing a clean groove that sighs softly into the quiet air, a sound so steady it becomes a kind of silence. At the end of the cut you lift the graver, not with a jerk, but with a smooth upward tilt that leaves the steel unmarked. Then you blow a soft breath across the groove to clear the tiny metal whisker that curls away. Your left hand, resting on the vise, rotates the lock plate by a degree or two, bringing the next section of the curve into alignment with the light. Then you lower the graver again, find the exact point where the cut ended, and press forward once more. The motion repeats. Press, lift, turn, breathe, press again. And the intervals between each step are so even that they could be measured by a slow pendulum. Your breathing has fallen into the same cadence without any effort. Inhale as you lift the graver. Exhale as you push, a gentle pause while you turn the work. The air moves in and out of your lungs in a shallow, restful tide that matches the pace of the cuts. You are not aware of any separate self doing the work, There is only the tool, the steel, the light, and the steady hum of attention that has no need to rush. The main stem of the scroll is being deepened now. With a second pass of the square graver, the groove widened by a hair so that it will stand more boldly when the shading lines are added later. This second pass requires exactly the same pressure as the first, no more, and your hand remembers the path as if reading it through your fingertips. The graver kisses the metal, sighs, lifts, and the line grows a shade darker. As the main stem curls into its central volute, you slow the pace even further. The spiral tightens with each fraction of an inch, and the rotation of the vise must become more delicate, your left thumb and finger nudging the lock plate in increments so small they are almost invisible. Inside the tightest curve, the graver's tip must turn more sharply, and you execute this by rolling the tool slightly between your thumb and index finger, while your palm continues its push. The sound changes here, a faint squeak that is not a complaint but a note of concentration, and when the final inner coil is cut, you lift the tool to find a perfect circle no wider than a lentil. You blow away the tiny shaving, it's so fine it floats for a moment before settling on the chamois marsh. And you pause to wipe the cut with the oiled linen, watching the dark ring appear against the grey like a drop of ink spreading in water. Without hurry, you move to the first tendril that branches from the volute, a line that flows outward and down, and you begin the same rhythmic deepening. Press, lift, turn, breathe. The graver sighs. The light through the window has not changed its angle in any way you can perceive, yet there is a sense of time passing, not as hours but as a slow accumulation of cut lines and cleared shavings. Your shoulders remain loose, your elbows resting lightly against your sides, and the stool creaks only when you shift your weight after many minutes of stillness. The sound of the graver is joined now and then by the faint tap of your little finger against the vise handle as you adjust the grip, a soft wooden tick that falls into the rhythm like a quiet metronome. The smaller tendril that will branch from this one appears first as a faint scribed guide, and you align the graver with it, starting the cut from the main line outward. The new branch is thinner than the parent, so you ease the pressure by a shade, letting the groove stay shallow, a delicate line that will later be shaded to appear as if it grows behind the main vine. The rhythm adapts without breaking. The lift comes a little sooner, the breath a little shorter, but the overall tempo remains as steady as a sleeping heartbeat. You work along this tendril for several inches of curved steel, watching the line emerge as if drawn by an invisible pen. And when you reach the end, a tiny countercurve that hooks back toward the stem. You complete it with a final lift and a soft blow. Then you sit back, not to rest, but to let your gaze travel the length of the pattern, noting how the deepened lines hold the light more richly than the first passes, like wet ink on dry paper. The feeling that fills the workshop now is not excitement or satisfaction, but something closer to the gentle hum of a spinning wheel, a continuous presence that asks nothing of you but your attention. You pick up the flat graver for a short task. The wider flares at the ends of two tendrils need to be opened into small fan shapes that will later hold leaf details. The flat graver's broader tip requires a different hold, the handle braced against the pad of your thumb rather than the palm hollow, and you make a few practice passes on the scrap brass to adjust your grip. Then you return to the lock plate, targeting the end of the left descending tendril, and you push the flat graver into the steel at a low angle, peeling away a thin curl that widens from a point into a smooth teardrop shape. The sound is a softer version of the square graver's sigh, more of a whisper, and you complete 3 such flares in succession. Press, lift, turn, breathe, press again. Each flare matches its neighbor in size and shape, and when you wipe them with the oiled cloth, they gleam like tiny mirrors set into the steel. Now the rhythm has become so deeply ingrained that you no longer think of it at all. Your hand moves, the tool cuts, the steel accepts, and the scroll work grows with the same quiet inevitability as frost spreading across a window pane. You add a series of small leaves along the main stem, using the lozenge graver for the fine strokes. Each leaf requires 3 tiny cuts, a central spine drawn with a single push, then 2 angled side strokes that meet at the leaf tip. The rhythm of these leaf cuts is slightly quicker, but still unhurried, a soft triplet that repeats 5, 6, 7 times as you work your way down the stem. Press, lift, turn, breathe becomes cut, clean, turn, cut again, and the leaves appear one after another, small and precise, no two exactly alike, but all part of the same quiet family. The graver's tip, still sharp from the morning sharpening, leaves clean edges that need only a gentle wipe to shine. The shadows in the room have begun to shift as the sun climbs past its noon height and starts its slow descent toward the western side of the building. The beam that once fell full upon the bench has narrowed into a ribbon of gold that cuts across the vise and spills onto the floor. You notice this without stopping. Your eyes register the changing light as a gentle cue to adjust the angle of the lock plate with a small turn of the vise's thumbscrew. The new angle catches the grooves perfectly, and you continue. The graver sighs. The steel gives way. The shavings curl up, one after another, tiny silver commas that collect in a line on the chamois like the shed petals of a metal flower. The pattern has now expanded to fill nearly all the space within the scribed borders. The main fine curls and loops across the upper third, its volute a dark eye at the center. The tendrils flow downward, crossing each other in a gentle weave that you have planned by eye rather than by measurement, trusting the organic feel of the design. Between the tendrils, small curling branches fill the empty spaces, and these you cut now with a light, almost casual touch, the graver moving in short arcs that loop back on themselves. The sound of these cuts is fainter, a soft scratching that reminds you of a mouse moving in straw, and you pause frequently to blow the dust away because the fine shavings tend to pack into the tight curves. Your lips purse and the breath comes out in a cool stream that clears the groove instantly. A quiet weariness begins to settle into your forearms, not a painful fatigue, but a pleasant heaviness that tells you the work has been steady and long. You welcome it, letting your elbows rest a little more heavily on the bench while your hands remain light and precise. The rhythm adjusts to accommodate this. The lifts come a fraction slower, the breaths a little deeper, and between cuts you sometimes pause to flex your fingers gently, feeling the slight stiffness that comes from holding the same position for an hour or more. You watch your own hands as if they belonged to someone else, marveling without excitement at the way the tendons move under the skin, the way the graver seems to float just above the steel before dipping down for another cut. No hurry stirs in any corner of the room. Even the dust motes drift with a drowsy indifference. As the afternoon wears on, you begin the final few tendrils, the little fillers that will complete the skeleton of the design. One of these runs horizontally just above the bottom border, a short, lazy curve that ends in a pair of tiny back-to-back spirals. You cut the first spiral by turning the vise at full circle, the graver riding the edge of the rotating steel, and the motion feels like drawing a perfect O with a pencil held very still. The second spiral you cut in the opposite direction, meeting the first at a point, and the result is a small S-shaped flourish that sits quietly at the margin. You wipe it clean and then sit back on the stool, your hands coming to rest on your thighs. For a long moment you do nothing but look at the lock plate, taking in the full design that now lives on its surface. The rhythm has left its mark not only on the steel, but in your body, a residual hum that you feel as a gentle vibration in your palms, an after-echo of the graver's sigh. The clock on the mantel, which you rarely notice, marks the half-hour with a single soft chime that dissolves into the air. You listen to it fade, then pick up the linen cloth and give the entire lock plate a thorough cleaning, drawing the cloth along every groove, every leaf, every spiral, until the steel is free of dust and oil. The engraving stands out dark and crisp, the matte grey background offering a calm contrast to the glossy cuts. You loosen the vise just enough to lift the lock plate out and hold it in your open palm, tilting it under the window light to watch the play of shadows along the curves. The scrollwork seems to move, a still dance frozen in metal, and you feel a quiet sense of completion that is not yet finished. There are hours of shading and stippling still to come, but the foundation is laid and the rhythm has carried you to this point without a single moment of strain. You return the lock plate to the vise, retighten the leather jaws, and let your hands fall back to your lap. Outside, the faint sound of a wagon rolling down the street reaches you, the wooden wheels crunching on packed earth, the driver's voice a distant murmur that fades as quickly as it rose. The workshop absorbs the sound and returns to silence. On the bench the gravers lie in their neat row, their wooden handles still warm, their steel tips still oiled and bright. The chamois beneath the lock plate is speckled with metallic dust that glints when the light catches it. You will clean the bench later. For now, the rhythm has paused, and you sit in the pause with the same patience that guided every cut. The scroll work waits, and you wait with it, breathing slowly, watching the afternoon light grow richer and more golden as the sun sinks toward the rooftops. The workshop has settled into a stillness so complete that the smallest sounds rise to the surface like bubbles in a quiet pond. You are seated at the bench with the graver in your hand, the lock plate angled in the vise, and for a long moment you do not move at all. In that motionless pause, the room begins to speak in its own faint language, a collection of tiny noises that ordinarily pass unnoticed beneath the current of activity. Now, with no other distraction, you hear them one by one, layered over the deep hush like thin lines of ink drawn on pale paper. The first sound is the one you know best, the whisper of the square graver as it begins a new cut. You have just touched the tip to the steel and pushed forward a fraction of an inch, and the metal answers with a soft shushing exhale, so light it could be the sound of your own breath made audible. The graver travels along a shallow curve, its keen edge parting the surface without resistance, and the note it produces is steady and even, a sustained hush that rises slightly as you press a little harder on the outer arc, then fades as you lift the tool at the end of the cut. The whisper stops, replaced by the briefest silence, and then you blow gently across the groove to clear the tiny silver shaving that has curled up from the steel. Your breath makes a rounded, hollow sound, like wind passing over the mouth of a small bottle, and the shaving flutters onto the chamois with a tick so faint it might be imagined. You set the graver down on the leather tool roll, and the gentle clink of hardened steel touching the wood beneath the leather punctuates the hush. This sound is crisp but small, the metal landing with a soft finality that does not echo, simply existing for an instant and then fading into the absorbent surfaces of the workshop. The oak bench, the plaster walls, the exposed timbers overhead all swallow noise rather than reflect it. The room has been built over years of labor into a place where sound dies quickly and peace remains. Now the graver rests, and your hand moves toward the small punch that lies waiting beside the oil bottle. You take up the punch, a slender rod of steel with a rounded tip no larger than a pinhead, and you position it over the terminal curl of a scroll that needs to be terminated with a decorative dot. The small cross-peen hammer is lifted in your other hand, its worn handle smooth against your fingers, and you bring it down in a controlled, gentle tap against the top of the punch. The sound that follows is a tiny, sharp tick, like a single drop of water falling into a stone basin, clean and brief. You tap again, just a hair to the left of the first dot, and another tick marks the creation of a second stipple point in the background field. The two ticks are not identical, the first slightly higher, the second a shade duller, but together they form a tiny duet that vanishes as soon as it sounds. You set the hammer aside and its wooden handle makes a light thud against the chamois, a soft percussive note that is almost apologetic in its gentleness. Beneath these deliberate sounds, the workshop holds other, more constant whispers. As you shift your weight on the wooden stool to reach for the oil bottle, the floorboards beneath you respond with a slow, low creak that travels through the plank like a sleepy groan. The creak rises in pitch for a half-second as the wood flexes, then settles back into silence when your weight finds its new balance. The boards have made this sound thousands of times every day of every year, and will make it for decades more, a familiar voice of the building itself. You do not register it with any alarm, only as part of the room's calm presence, a sound as natural as your own heartbeat. Outside the window, a sparrow has returned to the stone sill. Its arrival is announced by a quick flurry of wings, a soft feathery beat that brushes against the glass and subsides. Then it chirps, a single clear note that pierces the indoor quiet without disturbing it. The chirp is high and sweet, a little inquiry that seems to ask nothing and expect no reply. Another sparrow answers from somewhere down the street, its call more distant, a fainter echo of the first, and the two voices trade a few notes back and forth before falling quiet. The exchange drifts through the window as a thread of outdoor life that never intrudes, simply passes by like a cloud shadow moving across the floor. You hear it, acknowledge it, and let it go, your focus returning to the steel. The chamois cloth is in your hand now, and you wipe a thin film of oil from the surface of the lock plate, drawing the cloth in a slow arc that squeaks faintly against the metal. The squeak is high and brief, the sound of oil-saturated leather dragging over smooth steel, and it changes pitch as you cross a groove, dipping lower when the cloth catches on the edge of a cut, and rising again on the unengraved ground. You complete the wipe, fold the cloth once, and set it aside, the small sound of the fabric crumpling adding a soft rustle to the quiet inventory of noises. In the pause that follows while you examine the freshly cleaned scrollwork under the window light, you become aware of a new sound that has been present all along but only now rises to your attention. It is the clock on the mantel, an old timepiece with a brass pendulum that swings behind a glass door. The pendulum moves with a steady, unhurried beat, its swing producing a soft tick-tock that fills the room not as a noise but as a gentle pulse. The tick and tock are slightly different in tone. Tick is a fraction higher, the sound of the escapement catching on one side, while tock is a shade lower, the release on the other. The interval between them is perfectly even, a long second that stretches out and out, giving the room a slow, measured breath. You listen to this sound for several swings, and your own breathing begins to align with it, a peaceful synchrony that requires no effort. The clock continues its quiet reign while you return to the work. You pick up the lozenge graver this time, and the sound of its cut is different from the square graver's sigh. The lozenge makes a finer, higher whisper, almost a hiss, because its tip is narrower and the groove it cuts is shallower. You push it along a shading line that runs beside a main scroll, and the hiss rises thinly, a delicate sibilance that seems to float above the bench and then dissolve. Between cuts, you lift the graver and touch it to the Arkansas stone for a single pass to refresh the edge, producing a faint scratching that is rougher than the metal on metal of engraving. The stone's abrasive surface grates softly, a sound like sand shifting underfoot, and the steel responds with a quick shing that signals the removal of the tiniest burr. You lift the graver, wipe it with an oiled finger, and return to the lock plate. The sequence of sounds now a familiar pattern: hiss, scratch, shing, hiss, each separated by a beat of near silence. A new sound enters as you reach the end of a tendril and decide to apply a small burnishing stroke to smooth the edge of the cut. The burnisher, a polished steel rod, produces no cutting sound at all. Instead, it glides over the surface with a silky, nearly inaudible sigh that is more felt than heard. If you hold your breath and listen very closely, you can detect a faint swish, like a thumb sliding over clean glass. But on most passes, the tool is silent, its work done by pressure alone. This quietness makes the subsequent sounds more distinct: the tiny pop of an air bubble in the oil film, the creak of the wooden vice-screw when you adjust the jaws, the whisper of your sleeve brushing the bench edge as you reach for a fresh piece of chameau. The sparrow on the sill has been joined by a second bird, and together they begin a soft, conversational chirping that ebbs and flows without urgency. Their notes overlap gently, sometimes a single chirp, sometimes a short trill that rises and falls. The sound is like water trickling over pebbles, a liquid and pleasant background that filters into the workshop and mingles with the indoor quiet. You do not look up, but you notice how the chirps seem to pause when the clock ticks and resume when the echo fades, as if the birds are timing their calls to the pendulum's rhythm. This is only coincidence, but it adds to the sense that the whole world, inside and out, is moving in a single, slow dance. You set the gravers down for a longer rest and rise from the stool, your knees straightening with a quiet pop that is the only sound your body makes. The floor creaks under your step as you walk to the window, and each footfall produces a different note depending on which plank you cross. A deep groan near the bench, a lighter squeak by the door, a firm clump on the threshold stone. These footstep sounds are solitary and unaccompanied, no echo following them, just a brief declaration of weight and then silence. At the window you pause and look out through the small panes, and the glass itself offers a faint rattle as a breeze brushes the frame, a tiny chattering that lasts only a second and then ceases. You hear the breeze as well, a low sigh threading through the gap beneath the sash, and you feel its coolness on your face, but pay it no mind beyond acknowledging its presence. Turning back toward the bench, you notice a new sound, the soft, persistent hum of a fly that has entered through some unseen crack and now circles lazily near the ceiling. Its buzzing is low and uneven, rising in pitch as it flies toward the window and falling as it turns back toward the darker corner by the forge. The sound is almost musical, a drowsy drone that adds a layer of depth to the room's quiet symphony. You watch the fly for a moment, its tiny black body tracing lazy loops against the plaster. And then you return to your stool, the floor creaking once more as you sit. The fly's drone continues overhead, a sleepy ostinato that will accompany the rest of the afternoon. You take up the small brush that you used to clean the file and draw it across the chamois to sweep away the accumulated metal dust. The bristles make a soft, shushing noise, much like the graver's whisper, but broader and drier, and the dust stirs into a tiny cloud that glints in the window beam before settling. A few particles land on the oil bottle with a faint pattering, like sand blown against a wall, and then all is still again. You set the brush down, and the hollow wooden handle knocks once against the bench, a round, mellow talk that echoes briefly in the space beneath the worktop. With the bench now tidy, you lift the lock plate from the vise and hold it near your ear, not for any practical reason but out of a quiet curiosity. The steel, of course, makes no sound of its own, but as you tilt it, the residual oil in the grooves shifts with a nearly inaudible sticky whisper, a wet sound so faint you might have imagined it. You hold it there, breathing slowly, and you become aware of your own breath as a sound, the slow draw of air through your nostrils, a gentle wind that rushes softly in the small cavern of your sinuses, then the warmer exhale that leaves your lips with a light puff. You lower the lock plate and let your breath fall back into its silent rhythm, but you're now more attuned to the bodily sounds that accompany your work. The soft creak of your finger joints when you flex them, the quiet gurgle of your stomach after many hours without food, the occasional blink of your eyelids that you can almost hear as a tiny wet click. A church bell rings somewhere far across the town, its tone so distant that it reaches the workshop as a low, golden hum, a single toll that marks the hour without insistence. The sound hangs in the air for a long moment, vibrating against the window glass, then slowly fades until it is only a memory. You do not count the hour. You simply receive the bell as another thread woven into the fabric of the quiet. The clock on the mantel, as if in response, ticks on unperturbed, its pendulum swinging with the same ancient patience. You return the lock plate to the vise and take up the flat graver to cut a few broad leaves near the bottom border. The sound of the flat graver is a softer, lower version of the square graver's sigh, more of a whispery groan because the wider edge requires a steadier push. You lean into the cut, and the tool responds with a sustained sh that lasts for the entire length of the leaf, ending in a little puff as you lift and blow away the shaving. The shaving this time is wider, a tiny silver ribbon that curls and drops onto the chamois with a tick heavier than before. You repeat the cut for a second leaf and a third, and each time the sound is subtly different. The first leaf cut on a slightly rougher patch of steel produces a faint scratch, the second on a smoother section a cleaner hush, the third a combination of both. These variations are so minor that only an ear trained by years of listening would notice them, and your ear, without consciously trying, does notice, filing away the information for later adjustments. In the silence between the leaf cuts, the sparrow outside takes flight, its wings beating a rapid whir that buzzes past the window and then fades into the distance. The sudden absence of its chirping leaves a noticeable gap in the soundscape, a small emptiness that the clock's pendulum quickly fills. The fly, still circling, seems to take the bird's departure as a cue to descend, and its buzzing grows louder as it approaches the bench, veering close to the oil bottle before swerving away. You watch it without irritation, letting it trace its erratic path, and you even pause your work so as not to disturb its flight. The fly eventually settles on the window glass, its buzzing ceasing completely, and the room is once again reduced to the tick of the clock and the soft rustle of your sleeve as you reach for the linen cloth. The cloth wipes oil from the freshly cut leaves, and the squeak it makes is thinner this time because the oil is scant. You fold it to a clean edge and wipe again, and the sound is nearly gone, just a dry friction that whispers and then stops. All the while the pendulum swings, tick and tock, marking the slow passage of the afternoon with a constancy that feels like a heartbeat shared by the entire workshop. You begin to think, in a drowsy, peaceful way, that the room itself is alive with these small sounds, each one a quiet breath that sustains the stillness rather than breaking it. The whisper of the graver, the tap of the punch, the creak of the floor, the chirp of the sparrow, the tick of the clock. These are not interruptions, but the very substance of the quiet, the way the world speaks when there is nothing loud to say. You sit back and rest your hands on your lap, letting the full chorus of tiny noises wash over you. The fly buzzes once more, a brief experiment, then settles. The clock ticks. The oil settles into the grooves with an almost inaudible sigh. Somewhere outside, a door closes with a distant thud, and the sound travels through the street, softened by distance and walls, arriving as a low thump that barely stirs the air. You feel a deep sense of calm that comes not from the absence of noise but from the gentle presence of so many small, harmless sounds, each one a companion in the long quiet of the afternoon. The work will continue soon. The gravers are still sharp, the lock plate still waits, but for this moment you are content to simply sit and listen, to be the still center around which all the tiny sounds of the workshop gently revolve, a human ear at the heart of a peaceful, humming world. The light has changed. You first notice it not as a thought, but as a subtle shift in the way the graver's tip catches the gleam on the steel, a softening of the bright edge that had been your companion since early morning. When you lift your eyes from the lock plate and turn toward the window, you see that the sun has moved well past its noon height and now travels somewhere above the roof of the building across the street, no longer pouring its full beam through the small panes. The sharp rectangle of gold that once lay across the bench has dissolved into a gentler wash, still warm but less direct, spreading evenly through the room like honey thinned with water. The shadows that were crisp and dark at midday have grown softer at their edges, and the corners of the workshop, which you had forgotten in the brightness, now emerge from the dimness as quiet brown spaces filled with the shapes of stored tools and stacked lumber. You pause your cutting and lay the grazer down on the chamois, flexing your fingers slowly while you study this new quality of illumination. The unengraved surface of the lock plate, which under the noon sun glowed with a silvery grey, now appears deeper and cooler, its matte texture absorbing rather than reflecting the muted radiance. The cut lines, by contrast, seem to darken, the grooves holding the soft light in their depths like tiny canals filled with shadow instead of water. This change does not trouble you. It is simply the natural turning of the day, as expected, as the pendulums swing or the distant bell marking the passage of another hour. You have worked through this transition many times before, and you know that the afternoon will require its own adjustments, a new arrangement of light to keep the work clear and the eye steady. You rise from the stool, the floor creaking under your weight with its familiar low groan, and walk to a small cupboard set against the wall beside the cold forge. Opening the door, you reach inside and bring out a candlestick of tinned iron with a broad reflector behind its socket, a simple device made to throw the flame's light forward onto a work surface. The candle stub in the socket is still long enough for several hours of burning, its wick bent slightly from the last extinguishing, a tiny black curl atop the pale wax. You carry the candlestick to the bench and set it down to the left of the vise, positioning the reflector so that it faces the lock plate. Then you reach for the flint and steel that live in a small tray near the oil bottle, and with a practiced strike you draw a spark into the charcloth, coaxing a tiny orange glow that you nurse with a gentle breath until the wick catches. The flame steadies into a small bright leaf of yellow and blue, and the reflector catches its glow, directing a focused circle of warm light directly across the scrollwork. The candle's light is different from the daylight in every way. It is warmer in tone, tinged with amber, and it flickers almost imperceptibly as the flame sways in the mild currents of air that drift through the room. The steady beam from the reflector creates a small concentrated island of brightness on the bench, and beyond that island the rest of the workshop retreats into a soft dusk. Your hands, when you hold them over the lock plate, glow with a rosy warmth, and the engraved lines on the steel now seem to pulse gently with each tiny flicker, as if the scrollwork were breathing. The scent of burning tallow joins the linseed oil and the iron, adding a faint smokiness that is not unpleasant, the smell of centuries of craftsmen before you working by just such a flame. You settle back onto the stool and draw the candle a little closer, adjusting the reflector's angle with a light touch until the light falls exactly across the half-finished scrollwork. The design lies before you, the main vines and tendrils all cut and deepened. The first two shading lines drawn with the lozenge graver on the upper spirals, but the greater part of the shading remains to be done, and it is this delicate work that you now take up, knowing that the gentler afternoon light and the steady candle together will serve it well. Shading requires a different kind of seeing, a sensitivity to the finest variations in line thickness and depth, and the soft illumination does not glare or wash out the subtle marks as the harsh noon sun might. You lift the lozenge graver from its place on the leather roll and hold it for a moment, letting your palm grow accustomed to the familiar mushroom handle. This tool is finer than the square graver, its diamond-shaped tip ground to a sharper angle, designed not to cut bold structural lines, but to trace the hair-thin strokes that run parallel to the main curves, giving the illusion of depth and shadow. The steel shank feels slender and precise between your fingers, and you tilt it to catch the candlelight on its cutting face, checking the edge for the bright line that signals readiness. Satisfied, you touch it once to the oiled cloth on the bench, leaving a microscopic film that will help it glide through the metal without catching. The first shading line you choose is on the main volute at the top of the lock plate, the tight spiral that forms the center of the upper scroll. You lower the lozenge graver until its tip rests on the steel just to the right of the main groove, near the outer curve of the spiral, and you push forward with the lightest possible pressure. The cut that opens is so fine it seems barely there at all, a whispered scratch that catches the candlelight only when you tilt the work at the perfect angle. The line runs parallel to the main groove, following its curve at a constant distance no wider than a thread, and the sound it makes is the faintest hiss, a sound like a single grain of sand sliding down a pane of glass. You complete the line along the outer arc of the spiral, then lift the graver and blow away the invisible shaving, though there is almost nothing to see, only the idea of a line gleaming briefly before settling into the matte grey. You begin the second shading line just inside the first, this one tracing the same curve but slightly shorter, ending before it reaches the center of the spiral. The distance between the two lines is exact, measured by your eye rather than any tool, and you maintain this spacing by keeping the graver's tip aligned with the faint reflection of the first cut. A third line follows, even shorter, and a fourth, each one stepping inward toward the dark center of the volute, until the eye reading the spiral perceives a gradual deepening of shadow, a recession into the metal that does not physically exist. The candle flame wavers for a moment as a draft from the window shifts, and the lines seem to flicker in response, a tiny dance of light and dark that passes before the flame steadies again. You pause to wipe the work with a clean cloth, and the shading lines emerge from the oil smear as delicate as spider silk, perfectly parallel, perfectly spaced. The afternoon work continues in this manner, slow and concentrated, each shading line laid down beside a main curve with the same quiet precision. You move from the top volute to the long descending tendril on the left side, the one that curves down in a gentle S shape before ending in a tight counter curve. Here the shading lines must follow the changing direction of the main groove, bending with it, always maintaining that constant distance, that unwavering parallelism. You find that the candlelight helps in this task, its warm glow catching the main groove as a dark reference, while the fresh cut glints as a momentary brightness before the oil settles it into shadow. Your hand moves with a steadiness that comes from the slow rhythm of the afternoon, each push of the graver a small meditation, each lift a release. The stool creaks gently when you shift, the floor answers, the clock ticks, and the work proceeds as if it could go on forever without tiring. The shading progresses down the tendril, line by line, sometimes 3 or 4 parallel strokes close together where the scroll is wide, sometimes only a single line where the curve narrows near its termination. You vary the length of the shading lines according to the shape of the main groove, letting them die out gracefully as the curve tightens, so that the deepest shadow seems to pool where the metal turns most sharply. This is an effect you have learned over years, not through instruction but through the slow accumulation of observation, watching how light behaves on different surfaces and translating that behavior into steel. The candle's small flicker is almost helpful now because it mimics the way natural light never holds perfectly still, and the shading you cut must work under any illumination, not just the steady beam of the window at a single hour. A half hour passes, or perhaps an hour, you do not keep track. The lozenge graver grows warm in your hand, its wooden handle absorbing the heat of your palm, and you pause now and then to re-oil the tip with a gentle dab from your finger. The oil bottle sits uncorked at the back of the bench, its pale amber contents gleaming faintly in the candlelight, and each time you reach for it, the glass clinks softly against the wood. You have shaded the entire left tendril and begun work on the right one, which branches out near the bottom of the lock plate and curls upward in a loose arc. The shading lines here must cross a small area where the steel is slightly harder, a remnant of the forging that the file and stone could not entirely erase, and you feel the graver bite a little more firmly, the hiss of the cut deepening a fraction. You adjust by easing the pressure, letting the tool find its own way through the denser metal, and the line emerges just as fine as all the others, unbroken and clean. The candle has burned down by 1/4 of an inch, its flame now riding a little lower on the wick, and you reach over to trim the charred end with a small brass snuffer that hangs from the candlestick. The snuffer's blades meet the wick with a tiny, crisp snick, and the trimmed fragment falls into the reflector tray, still glowing faintly before it darkens. The flame rises again, brighter and steadier, and the circle of light on the lock plate regains its full warmth. You return to the shading, your hand finding its previous rhythm without a stumble, and the lines continue to multiply on the steel-like slow ripples spreading across a pond. The scrollwork is now more than half finished, its main architecture complete, and its shading well underway. Looking at it under the candle's glow, you can see the transformation that the afternoon has brought. What was once a flat network of dark grooves has begun to take on the illusion of depth and volume, the shaded areas receding, the unshaded highlights rising, the whole design gaining a gentle dimensionality that seems to lift it off the surface of the steel. You tilt the lock plate slowly in the candlelight and watch the shadows shift along the parallel lines, the way they pool and flow as the angle changes. The sight brings no excitement, only a calm acknowledgement that the work goes well, that the hours have been used peacefully, that the steel is slowly becoming what you knew it could become when you first drew it from the drawer this morning. The light outside the window has continued its slow decline, and the sky visible through the small panes now shows a paler blue, almost white near the horizon, with a faint apricot tint beginning to gather in the east, where the sun will eventually set. Inside the workshop, the candle circle has become the primary source of illumination, and the bench and your hands and the lock plate all exist within a warm amber bubble that seems to float in a sea of gathering dimness. You are comfortable in this bubble, your shoulders relaxed, your breathing slow and regular, your eyes soft on the fine lines that grow under your hand. The world outside, the street and the town and the whole colony of Pennsylvania with its distant rumblings, seems very far away and not particularly real, while this small circle of steel and brass and candle flame holds all the reality you need. You finish the shading on the right tendril and sit back, resting the lozenge graver on the chamois, while you roll your shoulders once, twice, feeling the pleasant stretch of muscles that have held a single position too long. The fly that was buzzing earlier has settled somewhere in the rafters and gone silent. The sparrows have left the windowsill for their evening roosts. Even the clock seems to tick more softly now, as if it, too, is growing drowsy with the advancing afternoon. You pour a few drops of oil onto a fresh corner of the cloth and wipe the entire lock plate carefully, cleaning every shaded line, every main groove, every unengraved space between. The steel gleams under the candlelight, the scrollwork standing out with a clarity that almost startles yet does not startle, because you have been watching it grow all day and know every line by heart. The work of shading will continue into the evening, for there are still leaves to detail and small spaces to fill with delicate cross-hatching, but the largest part of the task is done. You extinguish the candle, not because you have finished, but because you wish to see how the scrollwork looks in the pure, fading daylight, before you light it again for the final push. The flame goes out with a small curl of smoke that rises straight up and dissolves, and the workshop sinks back into the soft grey-blue light of early evening, a quiet interlude between the golden afternoon and the dark that will soon enough arrive. You rest your hands on the edge of the bench and sit motionless, watching the lock plate as the twilight deepens around it, the engraved lines now barely visible, reduced to a faint pattern of shadows on shadows, waiting patiently for the candle to be lit again and the work to resume. The candle has been lit again, and its small, steady flame throws a warm circle of light across the lock plate and the tools arrayed beside it. The shading lines are all in place now, the fine parallel strokes that give the scrollwork its gentle depth, and what remains is a different kind of work altogether, quieter even than the cutting of lines. You reach for a tool that has waited patiently in the leather roll all day, a small rounded punch no longer than your little finger, its tip ground to a smooth dome the size of a poppy seed. This punch will be used to tap a field of tiny dots into the background of the lock plate, a process called stippling, and it will take the remainder of the afternoon and perhaps some of the evening besides. Before you begin the stippling, you adjust the magnifying lens that has been standing idle on its brass arm at the back of the bench. The lens is a round piece of polished glass set in a brass ring, mounted on an articulated arm that can be swung into any position over the work. You pull it towards you now, the joints of the brass arm moving with a smooth, well-oiled grace, and position the lens about 6 inches above the lock plate. When you lean forward and bring your eye to the glass, the surface of the steel leaps into clarity, every tiny scratch and grain suddenly visible. The engraved lines looking as wide as canals, the unworked background a vast plain of grey metal waiting to be textured. The lens has a way of shrinking your world to a circle no wider than a coin, and as you settle your eye into that circle, the rest of the workshop fades into a soft blur at the edges of your perception. The rounded punch is taken up in your left hand now, held lightly between thumb and forefinger, its tip hovering just above the steel in the empty space between the main vine and the first shading line. In your right hand you lift the small crosspeen hammer, the same one you used earlier for the terminal dots, its handle warm and smooth against your palm. You touch the punch to the steel at a point just outside the engraved line, and with a gentle tap of the hammer, you strike the top of the punch once. The sound that rises is a tiny, sharp tick, clean and brief, and when you lift the punch a small round dot gleams in the steel, no deeper than a breath, catching the candlelight like a single grain of bright sand. You move the punch a fraction of an inch to the right and tap again, producing an identical tick and an identical dot, then again and again, each tap measured and light, each dot landing exactly where you intend. The rhythm of stippling is different from the rhythm of cutting, where the graver moved in long, flowing strokes. The punch moves in tiny hops, a series of small percussive events that build on each other like the individual notes of a slow melody. Tap and tick, lift and shift, tap and tick again. There is no sighing whisper here, only the precise metallic click of hammer meeting punch, followed by the near-silent rest between taps as you position the tool for the next dot. You settle into this new rhythm quickly, your right hand tapping with a gentle, consistent force, your left hand moving the punch across the background in a methodical pattern that ensures no two dots overlap and no empty space is left untextured. The sound is hypnotic, a distant, delicate percussion that reminds you of rain falling on a slate roof far away, each drop distinct but merging into a soft, steady patter that fills the quiet room. The background you are stippling is the area behind the scrollwork, the negative space that surrounds the vines and tendrils and leaves. By filling this space with a fine, even texture of dots, you will create a contrast that makes the smooth, untextured scrollwork appear to rise above the background, as if it were a separate layer of steel floating on a field of shadow. The principle is simple, but the execution requires patience of a kind that few possess. Each dot must be placed just so. Not too deep or it will punch through the lock plate and weaken it. Not too shallow or it will disappear under the final polish. The force of each hammer tap must be identical, and the spacing between dots must be as even as the weave of a fine linen cloth. Your eye, pressed close to the magnifying lens, guides your hand with a concentration that is not tense, but deeply relaxed, the kind of focus that comes when a task is repetitive enough to free the mind even as it occupies the body. You work across the background in small sections, starting at the upper left corner of the lock plate just outside the scribed border. The first section is a triangle of empty steel bounded by the borderline, the main vine, and the first descending tendril. Into this small shape you tap a field of dots, row upon row, each row slightly offset from the one before, so that the pattern is organic and irregular rather than rigidly aligned. The punch moves across the steel like a slow insect, stopping every fraction of a second to receive its tap. then shifting onward, leaving behind a trail of tiny bright impressions that glitter briefly before the oil settles into them and darkens them to a soft grey. The candle flame flutters once as a draft seeps under the door, and the dots seem to shimmer in response, a field of tiny stars winking in the circle of lens-magnified light. After a while the section is complete, a neat patch of stippled background that looks, under the lens, like the surface of a quiet sea under a gentle rain. You sit back from the magnifying lens and blink a few times, your eye adjusting to the wider view of the bench, and you examine the work with your naked eye. The stippled area has already begun to recede visually, the texture of dots catching the light differently than the smooth scrollwork beside it. The main vine and its shading lines, which before the stippling had seemed to lie flat on the surface, now appear to stand a little forward, as if they had been painted onto the steel with a very fine brush. The effect is subtle, almost an illusion, but it is exactly what you intended, and you feel a quiet measure of progress that asks no acknowledgement beyond a slow exhale through your nose. You wipe the stippled surface with a dry corner of the cloth, removing any stray particles, and then lean back into the lens to begin the next section. The second section is larger, a long curved space that runs beside the right descending tendril from its origin, near the volute down to its terminal spiral near the bottom border. This area will take longer, perhaps half an hour of steady tapping, and you settle into the work with a calm acceptance of the time it will consume. Tap and tick, lift and shift, the punch moving down the curve in tiny increments, the dots accumulating like sand poured from a slow hourglass. Your right hand grows warm from the repeated motion, the hammer handle pressing into the pad of your thumb, and every so often you pause to flex your fingers and roll your wrist before resuming. The clock on the mantel ticks in counterpoint to the punch, its deeper pendulum swing a slow bass note beneath the higher tap of the hammer. Together the two sounds weave a quiet texture of their own, a music made of time and metal, as soothing as any lullaby. The fly that had been dozing in the rafters stirs and buzzes once, a low drone that circles the room and then fades back into stillness. You do not look up. The circle of the lens holds your entire world, and within that circle the dots march steadily across the steel. There is a quiet satisfaction in watching the textured area grow, seeing the smooth, blank ground give way to this fine, granular shadow. It is not a dramatic transformation, not something that would catch a casual eye, but for you, who have been staring at this rectangle of steel since the morning light first touched the bench, it is a profound shift, the slow accumulation of thousands of tiny acts into a single, unified effect. Each dot alone means nothing. Together they become a quiet background against which the scrollwork can breathe. As you reach the midpoint of the long curved section, you pause to re-oil the tip of the punch, dabbing it lightly against the oiled cloth to prevent any microscopic buildup of steel from clinging to its rounded face. The oil glistens on the punch's tip for a second before you wipe it nearly dry, leaving only the thinnest film, and then you resume tapping. The sound of the hammer on the oiled punch is slightly softer, a muted tick rather than a sharp one, and you adjust your ear to this new note without thinking. The dots continue to appear, row after row, the stippled texture growing denser and more uniform as your hand maintains its steady, unhurried pace. The afternoon light outside the window has dimmed another shade, the sky beyond the small panes now a deeper blue, with the first hint of orange gathering along the rooftops. Inside the workshop, the candle's circle has become the only true light, and within that circle the magnifying lens focuses a smaller, brighter point onto the exact spot where the punch meets the steel. Your eye, 2 inches from the polished glass, blinks slowly and regularly, the lashes brushing the rim of the lens with a soft whisper you can almost hear. The world outside the lens has ceased to exist for you. There is only the steel, the punch, the hammer, and the quiet rain of dots spreading across the background. When the long section is finally complete, you sit back and stretch your spine, hearing the quiet pop of vertebrae settling back into place. The stool creaks under you, and you shift your weight to a fresh position before leaning into the lens once more. The next area to stipple is smaller, a narrow channel between 2 crossing tendrils near the center of the lock plate, and you work this section with the same patient care, the punch dipping in and out of the tight space like a needle through cloth. The dots here must be placed even more precisely because the space is so confined, and you slow your pace accordingly, each tap deliberate, each shift of the punch measured in fractions of an inch. The rhythm becomes almost a meditation, your breathing slow and deep, your mind empty of everything but the tiny circle of steel under the lens. As the last of the background sections nears completion, you notice that your left hand, the one holding the punch, has developed a faint tremor from the sustained grip. You set the hammer down and flex your fingers wide, then make a fist, then flex again, feeling the blood return to the fingertips with a warm tingle. You rest your hands on your thighs for a full minute, your eyes closed, listening to the clock and the candle, and the distant, muffled sounds of the town settling into evening. And then you open your eyes, pick up the tools, and finish the final patch of stippling with a short burst of taps that concludes in a last, definitive tick, the sound hanging in the air for a moment before the silence rushes back in. The background stippling is done. You push the magnifying lens aside on its brass arm and look at the lock plate with your naked eye, tilting it under the candlelight to see the full effect. The stippled areas have darkened beautifully, the thousands of tiny dots merging into a soft granular shadow that pushes the smooth scroll work forward, making it appear almost raised. The contrast is gentle but distinct, the engraved lines standing out against the textured background like dark cords laid on a bed of fine grey sand. You wipe the entire surface with a clean oiled cloth, and the metal gleams richly, the scrollwork catching the light while the stippling absorbs it. The whole design now possessed of a quiet, three-dimensional presence. But the chapter is not quite over. There remains the second task of the late afternoon, the addition of tiny leaves along the tendrils, small decorative flourishes that will soften the lines and give the scrollwork a more organic, living feel. You set aside the stippling punch and the hammer, and you reach once more for the lozenge graver, its fine diamond tip still sharp from the morning's honing. The magnifying lens is swung back into position, and you lean into it again, your eye finding the first tendril where it curves near the top volute. The leaves you will add are tiny things, each no larger than a grain of rice, formed by a cluster of 3 small dots and a quick curved stroke. You touch the graver's point to the steel just beside the tendril and press down lightly, creating a small dot that gleams like a dewdrop. Then you press a second dot beside the first and a third slightly offset, forming a tiny triangle that will serve as the base of the leaf. With a swift, controlled flick of the wrist, you draw a quick, curved stroke from the base outward, the graver carving a thin crescent that curls away from the tendril and tapers to a fine point. The entire leaf appears in less than 3 seconds, a miniature flourish that seems to sprout from the main vine like a real leaf from a living branch. You blow away the tiny shaving and examine the work under the lens, noting the clean edges and the smooth curve, and then you move on to the next leaf, placing it slightly further down the tendril on the opposite side. The rhythm of leaf making is quicker than the stippling but requires a different kind of precision, a small burst of fine motor control followed by a pause to assess. Each leaf is composed of the same elements, 3 dots, 1 curved stroke, but you vary their angles and sizes slightly, so that no 2 leaves are exactly alike, giving the scrollwork a natural asymmetry that pleases the eye. Some leaves curve sharply inward toward the tendril, others sweep outward into the empty background, and a few are paired in opposite-facing couples that balance each other across the vine. The candle flame sways gently as you work, casting small shadows that shift and dance around each new leaf, making the tiny form seem almost to move. You work your way down the first tendril, adding leaves at intervals that feel right rather than measured, trusting the instinct that comes from years of seeing similar designs on other lock plates and other rifles. The leaves accumulate slowly, a quiet garden growing on the steel, and under the magnifying lens each one appears as a perfect miniature, its 3-dot base dark and round, its curved stroke crisp and bright. You pause after each tendril is completed to clean the steel with the cloth and to check the spacing of the leaves, making sure they neither crowd the design nor leave it feeling bare. The clock ticks on, the candle burns lower, and the leaves continue to appear one after another, until every major tendril on the lock plate has been adorned with its small greenless foliage. You finish the last leaf on the lowest tendril and sit back from the lens, your eye tired in a pleasant way, your hands resting palms up on your thighs. The magnifying lens is pushed aside, and you pick up the lock plate with both hands, holding it close to the candle to see the full transformation. The stippled background glows softly, the shaded scrollwork stands in quiet relief, and the tiny leaves dot the tendrils like flecks of darker ink on a page of grey. The lock plate, which this morning was a blank rectangle of forged scaled steel, now carries a complete world of ornament. Every line and dot and leaf placed by a steady hand in a silent room. You set it down on the chamois and wipe it one final time, the cloth moving slowly over the textured surface with a soft shushing sound that is the last noise of the long afternoon. The workshop settles around you, dark now beyond the candle's small pool, and you rest in the quiet embrace of a task well advanced, the evening waiting patiently beyond the window glass. The magnifying lens swings back into position on its brass arm, and you lean forward until your eye finds the polished glass, the circle of the lock plate expanding once more into a world of grey steel and dark grooves. Almost all the lines have been cut, the shading drawn, the background stippled into a fine granular shadow, and the tiny leaves placed along the tendrils like quiet afterthoughts. What remains now is the final examination, a slow, careful inspection of every curve and corner under the heightened clarity of the lens, a process that will reveal any small imperfections still hiding in the metal. You hold the lock plate in your left hand, tilting it under the candlelight so that the engraved lines catch the flame at different angles. And with your right hand you steady the lens, bringing it close enough that the surface seems to fill the entire world. Your eye travels along the main vine first, the central spiral that began the scrollwork so many hours ago. The groove is clean and deep, its edges sharp under the magnification, the shading lines running parallel with a spacing so even they might have been drawn by a machine rather than a hand. Yet here near the outermost curve, where the vine begins to curl inward, you notice a slight shallowing of the cut, a place where the graver lifted a fraction too soon and left the line less bold than its neighbours. It is a tiny flaw, barely visible to the naked eye, but under the lens it stands out as clearly as a missed stitch in a length of cloth. You set the lock plate back into the leather-padded vise and reach for the square graver, its mushroom handle still warm from the morning's work, and you touch its tip to the shallow section with the gentlest pressure imaginable. The graver sighs once, a single short breath that deepens the groove by the merest hair, and then you lift it and blow away the silver shaving. The line is now even, the shallow spot corrected, and you move on, the lens tracking with you as your eye follows the vine deeper into its spiral. Other small imperfections reveal themselves as you continue the inspection. A terminal scroll at the end of the left descending tendril that could use a fraction more depth, a shading line on the right side that wavers for 1/10 of an inch before straightening, a tiny burr left clinging to the edge of a leaf. Each is addressed with the same unhurried care, the appropriate graver lifted and touched to the steel for a single corrective pass, the shaving blown clear, the surface wiped with a corner of the linen cloth. You do not rush from one spot to the next. Each correction is a small meditation in itself, a chance to bring the work one step closer to that state of quiet completeness you have been pursuing since the first cut was made. The sound of the graver during these touch-ups is softer than before, a delicate whisper that barely stirs the air, and the candle flame burns steadily without flickering, as if it too is holding its breath. After the last of the touched-up lines has been wiped clean, you remove the lock plate from the vise and hold it once more under the lens, turning it slowly, your eye tracing every line a second time. Now the grooves are all uniform, the shading consistent, the leaves crisp-edged, and the stippling even. There is a sense of finality that settles over the work, a knowledge that the cutting is truly done at last, and you set the lock plate on a fresh chamois with a feeling that is not relief but a gentle acceptance, the way a long walk ends not with triumph but with a quiet arrival. The next task is burnishing, a process that will smooth the edges of every cut and remove any microscopic burrs that your eye, even under the lens, could not detect. You reach for the burnisher, a slender rod of hardened steel whose tip is polished to a mirror brightness, and you draw it toward you across the bench. The tool feels cool and smooth in your hand, heavier than the graver's despite its small size, and you turn it over once to admire the way the candlelight glides along its curved face without a single scratch to interrupt its gleam. Before you begin, you wipe the lock plate one more time with a lightly oiled cloth, leaving a thin film that will help the burnisher slide without friction, and then you brace the steel against the shimmer with your left hand, while your right hand positions the burnisher at the edge of the first main groove, The stroke is slow and deliberate, the rounded tip of the burnisher pressing gently against the lip of the cut and moving along its length in a smooth, continuous motion. There is no cutting sound now, only a faint, silky hiss that is more a sensation than a noise, a subtle vibration transmitted up through the tool and into your fingers. Under the pressure of the burnisher, the sharp edges of the groove roll slightly inward, closing any tiny fractures and leaving the line as smooth as polished bone. You repeat the stroke along the same groove, this time with a fraction less pressure, polishing the surface to a soft luster that catches the light without glaring. Then you move to the next groove, and the next, working your way methodically through every cut on the lock plate, giving each one the same gentle attention. The shading lines receive an even lighter touch, the burnisher just kissing the steel as it passes, because these fine strokes could easily be flattened by too much pressure. You adjust your grip, holding the burnisher more loosely, letting its own weight do the work, and the tool glides over the hair-thin cuts with a whisper so faint it could be the sound of a moth's wing brushing a window pane. The leaves and their tiny dots are burnished individually, the rounded tip of the tool dipping into each small impression and rolling away the burred edge, leaving behind a clean, dark spot that will hold the lamp black later. Your hand moves with a steady patience, and the clock ticks on, marking the slow passage of the evening with its unchanging beat. As you work, you occasionally pause to run the pad of your thumb across a freshly burnished line, feeling the surface with the sensitive skin at the fingertip. A well-burnished cut should feel like silk, with no catch or roughness, and you test each section this way, your thumb moving slowly over the steel, like a blind reader tracing a line of raised text. Where a slight roughness remains, you return with the burnisher and stroke it once more, always in the same direction as the original cut, until the texture under your thumb is as smooth as the unengraved ground around it. The process is slow and repetitive, but it carries a deep satisfaction that is entirely silent, a wordless pleasure in the transformation of rough metal into something that feels almost alive under the touch. The entire lock plate is burnished at last, every cut and dot and leaf smooth to a flawless finish. You wipe the surface with a clean, dry cloth, removing the last traces of oil, and hold the steel under the candlelight to see how the burnished lines now glow with a soft, even sheen, the edges no longer sharp but gently rounded, the whole design looking as if it had been pressed into the metal rather than carved. The stippled background remains matte and dark, absorbing the light, while the scrollwork itself seems to float above it, a quiet testament to the hours of patient labor that have brought it into being. The final step is to bring out the pattern with a mixture that will darken the engraved lines and make them stand out in bold relief against the grey steel. You turn to the small cupboard by the cold forge and retrieve two small containers, one of beeswax and one of lampblack, the soot collected from the candle's own smoke over many days of burning. The beeswax is a pale, honey-coloured lump that smells faintly sweet, and the lampblack is a fine, velvety powder that stains your fingertips as black as ink. You blend them together on a small flat stone, adding a single drop of linseed oil to soften the wax, working the mixture with the tip of a wooden spatula until it becomes a smooth, dark paste the colour of a moonless night. The paste gleams dully in the candlelight, thick and rich, and you lift a small dab of it onto the end of your finger. You apply the mixture to the lock plate with a gentle circular motion, rubbing it into every engraved line with the ball of your thumb. The wax carries the lamp black deep into the grooves, while leaving the unengraved surface mostly clean. And as you work, the scrollwork begins to darken, the lines turning from the pale grey of burnished steel to a deep, warm black that catches no light at all. The transformation is slow and beautiful, the pattern emerging more clearly with each pass of your thumb, the main vines becoming bold black strokes, the shading lines delicate dark threads, the tiny leaves crisp black silhouettes against the grey. You work the mixture into every corner of the design, paying special attention to the stippled background, pressing the paste into the thousands of tiny dots so that each one becomes a dark point of shadow, deepening the overall texture. When the entire lock plate has been coated, you let the mixture sit for a short while, the wax firming slightly as it cools, the lampblack settling into the microscopic crevices of the steel. The workshop is very quiet now, the only sounds your own slow breathing and the soft tick of the clock, and you use this pause to stretch your fingers and roll your neck, feeling the pleasant ache of a day spent in concentrated stillness. The candle has burned down by another inch, and you make a mental note to replace it soon, but for the moment the flame is still strong, and its light falls across the dark pasted lock plate with a warm golden glow that makes the blackened lines look like ink spilled on a sheet of pewter. The moment has come to wipe the lock plate clean, and you take up a soft, clean rag, one that has been set aside for just this purpose, free of oil and grit. With a gentle, sweeping motion, you begin to wipe away the excess mixture from the surface, drawing the cloth across the steel in long, even strokes that follow the direction of the grain. The wax and lampblack lift easily from the unengraved ground, leaving it a clean, matte grey, while the mixture that has lodged in the grooves and dots remains behind, held fast by the depths of the cuts. As you wipe, the full design reveals itself, the scrollwork standing out in bold, dark lines that are sharp and crisp against the pale steel, every curve and spiral and leaf now perfectly defined. The shading lines show as a soft gradient of darkness, the burnished highlights gleam subtly beside them, and the stippled background, free of the wax but still dotted with a million dark points, provides a textured shadow that makes the entire composition seem to rise from the metal. You wipe the lock plate a second time with a fresh corner of the cloth, buffing the surface to a gentle sheen, and then you hold it up under the candlelight to see the final result. The engraved scrollwork, now filled with a rich black mixture, looks as if it has always been a part of the steel, as if the design grew there naturally rather than being carved by human hands. The lines are black as charcoal, the unengraved steel a soft dove grey, and the contrast between them is so clear that the pattern can be read from across the room, every delicate detail immediately visible. The burnished surfaces catch the light and throw it back in tiny shimmering highlights that move as you tilt the lock plate, giving the scrollwork a quiet, subtle life that seems to shift and breathe with the flicker of the candle. There is nothing more to do. The lock plate is complete. Its transformation from a rough forged scaled blank to a finished piece of ornament accomplished over the course of a single unhurried day. You set it down on the fresh chamois and wipe your hands on a rag, removing the last traces of lampblack from your fingertips. And then you simply look at the work for a long, still moment. The feeling that accompanies this final look is not pride in the usual sense, not a swelling of the chest or a desire to show it to another, but a quiet, inward settling, the peace of a task brought to its natural end. Every cut, every shading line, every stippled dot, every burnished edge and darkened groove has been made with care, and now they all rest together in the stillness of the finished steel, asking nothing more of you. The tools on the bench, the gravers and the punch, the burnisher and the files, all lie at rest, their work completed. The candle burns low in its socket, the flame shrinking as the wax pool deepens, and outside the window the sky has turned a deep, velvety blue, the first stars beginning to appear above the rooftops. The town is silent, the street empty, and the workshop itself seems to hold its breath, as if it too is aware that something quiet and good has been brought to completion within its walls. You rise slowly from the stool, your body moving with the heavy ease of a day well spent, and you carry the lock plate carefully to the place where it will wait for tomorrow, a clean shelf near the finished rifle barrels, where it will rest until the morning when it will be fitted to the lock mechanism and become part of a Kentucky long rifle. You set it down gently, the steel cool against your palm, and then you step back, leaving it to its silent vigil, a small rectangle of beauty waiting in the dimness of the evening workshop. The lock plate rests in the center of the bench on a clean chamois skin, its surface catching the last light of the candle as the flame burns low in its iron socket. You have carried it from the shelf where it waited briefly and set it down here so that you might look at it one final time before the workshop settles into darkness. The engraving is complete, every scroll and tendril and leaf darkened with the beeswax and lampblack mixture, every background space stippled into a soft granular shadow, every edge burnished smooth as river stone. The steel no longer resembles the rough grey blank you drew from the drawer this morning. It has become something else entirely, a quiet object of patience and skill that holds the whole day inside its small rectangle. You do not pick it up again, but simply let it lie there on the soft pale leather, the chamois drawn up around its edges like a protective hand, and for a long moment you are still. The workshop around you has grown dim. The candle is the only light, and its flame has shrunk to a small blue and orange tongue that wavers gently each time a draft sneaks under the door or through the window frame. The reflector behind the flame still catches the glow and sends it forward onto the bench, but the circle of light has contracted, pulling inward until it barely reaches the edges of the chamois. Beyond that circle, the room fades into deep brown shadows that swallow the stacked rifle barrels, the cold forge, the racks of chisels and saws, all the silent tools of your trade, standing at rest like sleeping animals. The window shows a rectangle of deep blue twilight, the color of the sky just after the sun has gone, but before the first stars have fully awakened. Through the small panes you can see the roof of the building opposite, its shingles now a dark silhouette against a sky that is slowly turning from blue to indigo. No light burns in any window across the street. The town has retired early, as it always does, and the silence outside is complete. You turn your attention from the lock plate to the tools that lie scattered around the bench, and you begin the slow ritual of putting them away. The square graver is lifted first, its mushroom handle still carrying the warmth of your palm from the many hours it spent in your grip. You turn it over once, examining the cutting tip under the candlelight to make sure no burr has formed during the final touch-ups, and then you wipe the steel shank with a lightly oiled cloth, drawing the fabric from the handle to the point in one long, smooth motion that leaves a thin protective film on the metal. The graver goes into its leather pocket with a soft, snug fit, the handle nestling into the depression it has worn over many seasons. You roll the tool pouch forward to expose the next empty slot and lift the lozenge graver, wiping it with the same care, turning it to catch the light one last time before it too slides into its pocket and disappears from view. The flat graver follows, then the small, rounded punch, then the crosspeen hammer with its tiny polished face, each one cleaned and oiled and returned to its designated place. The burnisher is the last of the steel tools to be put away. Its mirror-bright tip requires a gentle buffing with a dry cloth to remove any trace of oil before you roll it into the pocket that holds the finishing implements. The leather tool roll is now full, each pocket occupied, each tool resting in the dark. You lift the whole bundle by its edge and roll it up slowly, tucking the end under, then tie the thin cord around it with a simple loop that you have made so many times your fingers complete it without any thought. The roll goes to the back of the bench, where it leans against the wall in its accustomed spot, waiting for the next day of work that will come after a night's rest. The Arkansas stone is wiped clean of oil and metal dust, its grey surface once again pale and dry, and you set it in its wooden holder beside the tool roll. The small oil bottle is corked and placed on the shelf above the bench, next to the tin of beeswax and the jar of lamp black, their lids screwed tight. The magnifying lens on its brass arm is swung back until it folds against the wall, the glass winking once in the candlelight before it settles into shadow. You gather the used chamois cloths from the bench, 3 of them, each one speckled with metallic dust and darkened with oil, and you fold them into a neat pile. They will be taken to the wash basin later, soaped and scrubbed and hung to dry, but for tonight they simply sit at the corner of the bench, a small reminder of the work that has been done. The linen rags you used for wiping the oil and the lampblack are likewise folded and set aside, and the wooden tray that caught the metal dust is lifted from the floor and emptied into a small clay jar kept for such sweepings. The dust falls with a soft, dry rustle, the sound of a long day's accumulation settling into its final resting place, and you set the tray back on its hook beneath the bench. Now the bench is nearly bare, only the lock plate on its chamois and the candle and the vise remaining. You loosen the wooden screw of the vise slowly, feeling the resistance give way through the handle, and you slide the leather pads from the jaws to inspect them. They are still supple and unmarked, the dark oiled surface free of cuts or gouges, and you return them to their position with the same care you used this morning when you first set the lock plate between them. The vise is left open, its jaws slightly parted, as if it too is resting after a long day's labor. You turn the swivel one last time to align the vise with the edge of the bench, tightening the thumb screw just enough to hold it steady, and then you step back and let your hands fall to your sides. The candle flame gives a small flutter as a current of air moves through the room and you watch it recover, steadying itself into a calm, pointed glow. The wax has melted into a deep pool around the wick, and the candle stub has shortened to less than an inch above the socket. It will burn for a little longer, enough to light your final tasks, but soon it will gutter and go out, and the workshop will belong to the night. You do not rush to extinguish it. There is still time to stand in the quiet and let the day release its hold on you. You loosen the ties of your leather apron and lift it over your head, the straps sliding from your shoulders with a familiar softness, and you hang it on the peg beside the door, where it has hung every evening you can remember. The apron smells of oil and metal and the faint sweetness of beeswax, and it will carry that scent until you put it on again tomorrow. In the dimness, you move to the window and rest your fingertips on the wooden sill, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath the wood. Outside, the street is a silent channel running between the dark buildings. No cartwheels sound on the packed earth, no voices call, no dogs bark in the distance. Even the wind has settled, leaving the air still and heavy with the quiet of the coming night. A single star has appeared in the patch of sky visible through the window, a small, steady point of light that seems to look down on the sleeping town with the same patient stillness that fills the workshop. You watch the star for a while, your breathing slow and regular, and then you turn back to the bench where the lock plate still waits in the center of the chamois. The engraving is even more beautiful in the low light, the dark lines of the scrollwork seeming to absorb the candle's glow, while the unengraved steel reflects it softly. You stand over the bench and look down at the lock plate without any outward expression. Your face is calm as the steel itself, simply registering the quiet completeness of the thing you have made. The central volute at the top curls inward with a grace that pleases the eye. The tendrils flow downward in balanced asymmetry. The shading lines give depth without heaviness, and the tiny leaves cluster along the vines like faithful companions. The stippled background recedes into a gentle shadow, and the whole design rests on the steel as if it had grown there over a long, slow season rather than a single day's work. There is no flaw that your eye can detect, no mark left uncorrected, no detail that asks for more attention. The lock plate is finished. You think, without forming actual words, about the rifle that will eventually carry this lock plate. It will be a Kentucky long rifle, slender and graceful, its maple stock carved by another pair of hands in another workshop, its barrel rifled by a smith whose name you may never know. The lock plate will be fitted into the stock, its engraved face outward for all to see, and someday a hunter or a farmer will lift the rifle from its place above a mantle and carry it into the woods. The scrollwork will glint in the filtered sunlight of a Pennsylvania forest, the darkened lines catching the eye of the bearer for a moment before the task at hand calls his attention away. But that is in the future, a distant and uncertain thing that does not concern you now. The lock plate story for tonight is simply that it exists, complete and whole, resting on a chamois in the quiet workshop. You pick up the lock plate one last time, cradling it in your palm with the same care you have given it all day. The steel is cool now, having lost the faint warmth it gained from your hands during the engraving, and it feels solid and reassuring against your skin. You tilt it toward the candle, and the light travels across the surface, dipping into the grooves and rising over the burnished highlights. A slow journey that reveals every detail in succession. Then you set it back down on the chamois, centering it exactly, and you fold the corners of the soft leather loosely over it, not to hide it, but to protect it from any dust that might settle overnight. The lock plate will sleep beneath this covering until tomorrow, when it will be taken up again and mated to the other parts of the lock mechanism. The tools are all put away, the bench is clean, the apron hangs on its peg, and the only task that remains is to put out the candle. You lift the brass snuffer from its hook on the candlestick and hold it over the flame for a moment, hesitating not out of reluctance, but out of a quiet appreciation for the light that has served you so well. The flame dances once, twice, and then you lower the snuffer gently until the tiny bell covers the wick, cutting off the air and extinguishing the fire with a soft hiss. A thin curl of smoke rises from the snuffer's edge, carrying the faint smell of tallow, and then it dissipates in the dark air and is gone. The workshop falls into complete darkness, the deep blue-black that is almost palpable, and you stand very still, letting your eyes adjust. In that darkness, the silence of the workshop becomes even more pronounced. You can hear the tiny settling sounds of the building itself, a beam shifting almost imperceptibly overhead, a faint creak from the floorboards as the night's coolness contracts the wood, the distant sigh of the chimney drawing the last warmth from the dead fire below. These are not sounds that intrude. They are the breath of the old building, as natural as your own heartbeat, and you have heard them so many nights that they are as familiar to you as the ticking of the clock. The clock, in fact, is still ticking, its pendulum swinging in the dark, an arm's length from where you stand, and you listen to its steady, unhurried rhythm for a full minute. The tick and tock marking the slow passage of time into the deep silence of the night. You move carefully through the dark, your feet finding the path to the door by memory rather than sight. Your hand finds the iron latch, and you lift it slowly, the metal cool under your fingers, and the door opens with a soft, low groan that is the last sound you will make in the workshop tonight. You step across the threshold into the small back room that serves as your living quarters, and you turn to look back into the workshop one last time. The room is a sea of darkness, but you can just make out the faint rectangle of the window, the slightly lighter shape of the chamois on the bench, the dim outline of the tools hanging on the wall. It is enough. You close the door with a gentle push, the latch falling back into place with a quiet click, and the day is over. On the bench, in the darkness, the lock plate rests beneath its soft leather covering. The scrollwork engraved upon its surface is invisible now, hidden by the night and the chamois. But it is there, as real as the steel itself, a small garden of curves and shadows that will wait patiently for the morning. The window shows only deep blue twilight fading into black, and the star you noticed earlier has been joined by a scattering of others, faint pinpricks of light that shine down on the silent street and the quiet roof and the still workshop, where a single craftsman spent an entire day attending to one patient task. The building holds the memory of that day in its walls, the whisper of the graver, the tap of the punch, the soft glow of the candle, the smell of oil and wax and iron, all these things resting now in the profound peace that follows completion. There is nothing more to say about the lock plate or the workshop or the gunsmith who made it. The story of this day has reached its natural end, a quiet closing that asks for no applause and no acknowledgement. The street outside will stay silent until dawn. The town will sleep, and inside the dark workshop the lock plate will wait for tomorrow's assembly, with the same patience it has shown all through the long, slow hours of its creation. The night settles in, gentle and deep, and everything is still.